Hey guys, tonight we're slipping past the drawbridge, past the guards, past the torchlit corridors, and right into the softest, most intimate, and honestly least understood part of castle life, the bedroom. Or, well, something that sort of pretends to be a bedroom. Because in a medieval castle, bedroom is a bit of a stretch. More like drafty stone chamber with a four-poster that could double as a boat, and about 17 people loitering around while you're trying to get lucky. Yeah, you probably won't survive this. Not romantically, anyway. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I don't want to force you into a lifelong vow of loyalty, unless that's your thing. And hey, let me know in the comments, what city are you watching from, and what time is it where you are? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself walking barefoot on worn stone tiles. The torchlight flickers, and the air smells faintly of smoke, lavender and wool that hasn't dried properly. You push open a thick wooden door and step into a chamber that is, by medieval standards, the height of luxury. There's a fire hissing in the hearth, though it can't quite fight off the chill seeping through the walls. Rushes, straw mixed with sweet herbs, cover the floor, crackling underfoot and releasing the scent of thyme and old foot sweat. A wooden canopy bed stands against one wall, draped with heavy tapestries meant to trap what little heat there is. Honestly, they also muffle the moans. This is the Lord's chamber, but he's rarely alone here. There are servants bustling about, guards posted near the door, maybe even a scribe hunched over a desk catching up on documents, while the Lord and Lady do whatever they're going to do. Privacy? Never really invented. Curtains around the bed help, but everyone hears everything. If you're hoping for a modern-style night of passion under dim lights with mood music, sorry. Your playlist is just the crackling fire, the creak of bedposts, and the distant clatter of horseshoes in the courtyard. You crawl under the covers, wool blankets and heavy furs piled high. It's warm, at least, and that's a blessing, because most castles were absurdly cold. Those stone walls, great for defence, terrible for holding in heat. During winter, it's not unusual for people to sleep fully clothed, and sometimes even wear hats in bed. So that sexy slow strip scene? More like peeling layers of rough linen, scratchy wool, and maybe a chainmail shirt if you're into knights. Also, the laundry situation? Don't ask. You do not want to know how often anything gets washed. Here's a weird fact. People used to sleep in two phases. First sleep started after sunset, then around midnight folks would wake up for a bit. Maybe pray, maybe have a snack, maybe, well, get busy. Then, second sleep carried them into morning, so your romantic rendezvous might be scheduled right in that midnight lull between dreams and dawn. Honestly, it sounds kind of cozy. Imagine waking up next to someone snuggling closer and knowing you've got a second nap waiting after the deed's done. Now let's talk beds. They were big, like suspiciously large, partly because more than two people might sleep in them. Lords, ladies, kids, servants, even guards during tense times. But even during private hours, these beds were the site of important political actions, including the all-important consummation of marriage. A king might send officials to witness the wedding night, making sure everything went according to plan. You can't make this up. There were literally men whose job was to watch someone else have sex and then say, "Yes, Your Grace, that was definitely penetration." They might even check the sheets afterward. The medieval HR department was not messing around. You glance at the walls. Tapestries depicting battles, saints, and some suspiciously sensual angels gaze down at you. One scholar once argued that these images shaped medieval erotic imagination. After all, most people didn't have access to anything steamier than a carved wood panel or a church fresco with some vaguely exposed knees. And with the church breathing down everyone's neck, sex was always in this strange dance of being necessary and deeply shameful. But don't be fooled. Just because religion told people to be chaste doesn't mean they were. Not even the clergy. In fact, one hotly debated topic among historians is how much actual abstinence existed in monastic life. One medieval bishop reportedly said, "A celibate priest is like a unicorn, much talked about, never seen." Which brings us to one of tonight's open scholarly debates. Were people in castles actually having less sex than we imagine, or more, just under very different rules and expectations? The evidence is frustratingly uneven. Letters, poetry, and scandalous court records suggest a lot was going on, but filtered through layers of metaphor, censorship, and the fact that very few people wanted to write, "Dear Diary, got frisky by candlelight again." But we do know this. There was a constant tension between duty and desire. Noble marriages were contracts, designed to create alliances and produce heirs. Love, optional, sex, mandatory. And sometimes, people just couldn't fake the chemistry. There are documents, actual royal complaints, where nobles accused their spouses of not doing their duty in bed. One even claimed his wife lay stiff and unmoved as a block of marble. Yikes. On the flip side, when things did get steamy, it was a whole production. Scented oils, music, poetry, and if the couple could afford it, a private bath beforehand. Think less romantic getaway, and more opulent, lukewarm tub in a corner of the room while 3 servants awkwardly pretend not to watch. You roll over, trying to get comfortable in the absurdly lumpy mattress, and your foot hits something hard. A wooden box. Ah, yes, the chamber pot. Because midnight bathroom runs down a spiral staircase. No thanks. Honestly, the smell explains a lot about why people preferred herbs strewn on the floor. And finally, as your eyes flutter closed, you can't help but imagine all the whispered confessions, stolen kisses, and dramatic betrayals that took place right in this room. Every stone in these walls could tell you something, if only they hadn't been sworn to medieval silence. You wake up still nestled in the creaking, high-framed bed, the furs twisted around your legs and a distant church bell tolling somewhere beyond the ramparts. The stone walls are no warmer than they were when you fell asleep, and the morning light slants in through narrow windows that were clearly designed to keep arrows out, not sunlight in. And here's the thing you start to realise as you stretch your arms and try not to bump your head on the carved wooden canopy. This bed wasn't just made for sleeping. In fact, sleeping was probably one of its less important functions. Medieval beds were status symbols first, multi-purpose furniture second, and only maybe comfortable third. The bigger and taller the bed, the more impressive it was. A noble's bed might sit on a platform and be layered with straw mattresses, feather ticks, and rich linens. It might take a literal footstool to climb in, like ascending the throne of unconsciousness. And when it came to sex, well, it wasn't exactly a secret activity. If you were important, you weren't expected to sneak off somewhere. Your marital bed was often the stage for your public obligations, including the production of an heir. And sometimes, that stage came with a live audience. You sit up, glance around the room again, and yep, just as expected, there's a servant folding clothes in the corner and a young page hauling in a bucket of water. No one's particularly concerned about your lack of modesty. In the Middle Ages, bodies weren't hidden in the same way we think of today. The idea of total nudity being shocking was more a product of later puritanical eras. Here and now, it's just another morning in a very shared space. It wasn't uncommon for noble couples to share their room, and sometimes even their bed, with others. Children, maids, guards, wet nurses, even favoured pets might be curled up in the same space. In one courtly document, there's even a complaint from a nobleman that his dog kept biting his toes in the night. Romantic, right? But really the giant bed served a larger purpose. It was where people conducted business, met with guests, and occasionally sealed alliances. It was less restful sanctuary and more power sofa that occasionally hosted sex. Let's talk about the noise. Wood creaks, and these old frames creak loud. No coil springs here, just ropes or wooden slats beneath the mattress. There's a reason the phrase "sleep tight" comes from the practice of tightening bed ropes every night to keep the mattress from sagging. And when those ropes got loose, well, let's just say the soundtrack of passion included some very unsexy groaning from the furniture. Here's where it gets unexpectedly theatrical. In many noble households, the couple's bed wasn't just for their own use. It could be used to demonstrate or prove their union, literally. In cases of politically arranged marriages, the consummation might be semi-public. Witnesses were sometimes invited into the chamber, standing discreetly nearby, or not so discreetly, while the newlyweds did their duty. In France, it was known as the bedding ceremony, and involved the couple being tucked into bed together by family members. Sometimes they drank warm wine, exchanged symbolic items, or had prayers read over them. And then, the crowd shuffled out. Or didn't, depending on the kingdom and how nosy everyone was. The point was to eliminate doubt. Yes, this marriage is real, and yes, it has been physically sealed. Think of it like a wedding reception with much worse lighting and considerably more pressure. It's horrifying by modern standards, but back then, just part of the aristocratic checklist. And if there were rumours that things didn't go as planned, it could spark investigations, annulments, or entire wars. Bedroom politics were national politics. Let's hit you with a quirky fact. In some noble homes, bed sharing wasn't limited to spouses. Travellers, guests, even political allies might be invited to share a bed for the night. Not necessarily for sex, though sometimes that happened, but as a gesture of trust. It was considered a sign of hospitality and intimacy to lie next to someone, chat, and fall asleep beside them. If you're thinking this sounds like a sleepover with potential for scandal, you're not wrong. But what about comfort? Surely the noble elite had the comfiest beds, right? If you were rich, your bedding might include imported silk sheets and velvet quilts. But no central heating meant that the room was always cold, the bedding always needed fluffing, and lice were a very real issue. Remember, bathing was occasional, and mattress maintenance wasn't exactly a thing. Over time, the whole setup started to smell a bit lived in, and those luxurious bed curtains, not just for dramatic flair, they were practical too, designed to trap body heat and offer at least a token nod toward privacy. But even that privacy was relative. If you think the servants weren't listening in, you're fooling yourself. Gossip was the real currency in any castle, and nothing fueled it quite like suspicious groans coming from behind velvet drapes. Historians debate just how much autonomy noblewomen had in these arrangements. Did they have any real say in when or how sex happened? The records are fuzzy. Some queens and noble ladies clearly held power and could refuse their husbands, especially if they were politically savvy. Others were expected to submit, no questions asked. But some letters survive that suggest real affection between couples. One French countess wrote to her husband describing dreams she had about him while he was away, in language that was tender and a little steamy. So love wasn't off the table. It just had to navigate a minefield of expectations. You stretch again, thinking about how surreal this all is. The giant bed, the constant presence of other people, the strange mix of duty and desire. It's a far cry from what we picture when we imagine a romantic night in a castle. The truth is, the bed was less a private retreat and more a functional piece of a very public life. Everything in it had a purpose. Political, familial, religious, even symbolic. And in a world where lineage was everything, what happened under those embroidered covers could change the course of entire kingdoms. So the next time someone swoons over the idea of a romantic castle getaway, feel free to ruin it for them with the image of 3 servants, 2 dogs, and a priest standing politely nearby, waiting for confirmation that the deed is done. You try to shake off the feeling that someone's watching you, and then remember, in this castle, someone probably is. Always. Privacy, as we think of it, hasn't been invented yet. Not here, not now. You look around the chamber again, and it clicks. Even the act of shutting a door doesn't guarantee you're alone, because in medieval castles doors are barely deterrents. Servants come and go with barely a knock, pages loiter outside chambers waiting for orders, and guards stand just out of sight, always listening. Even at your most intimate, you're never truly off stage. Now imagine being a noblewoman in this world. You wake up, your husband already gone, maybe to the hunting fields or council chamber, and before you've even wiped the sleep from your eyes, your lady-in-waiting is untying your nightrobe, brushing out your hair, and asking what you'd like for breakfast. You can't even pick the lint out of your navel without someone watching. From dawn until long after dusk, your body isn't really yours. It belongs to your family, your household, your kingdom. You're a vessel for politics, and unfortunately for you, everyone has the right to peer into that vessel. Let's say it plainly, privacy was a luxury even nobles couldn't afford, and not just in the bedroom. In castles, the design itself prevents any real alone time. Hallways are narrow, rooms are stacked together, and even the Lord's private solar, the closest thing to a personal den, is often occupied by scribes, advisors, or overeager relatives hoping to get in a word between mouthfuls of porridge. Want to whisper sweet nothings to your lover? Better be fluent in the art of veiled language and double meanings, because guaranteed someone's standing nearby holding a wine jug and eavesdropping with both ears. Of course, the idea of alone time wasn't even a common desire. Medieval culture was deeply communal. People slept, ate, bathed, and even prayed in groups. Solitude wasn't something most people longed for. It was often associated with monks, hermits, or outcasts. So while we think of romance as something candlelit and private, Back then it was more like candlelit and shared. Romantic gestures often happened in plain sight, embedded into dances, poems, or accidental touches during feasts. Now here's a weirdly delightful fringe fact. Noble households sometimes had a designated watcher on wedding nights, not just to confirm consummation, but to ensure everything went smoothly. Sometimes it was a female attendant, a wet nurse, or even a midwife in waiting standing by in case the bride freaked out or passed out. These women might offer calming herbs, wine, or the medieval equivalent of "breathe, sweetie, you've got this." And if something went wrong, well, she was also the one who had to explain it to the priest and the mother-in-law. Fun job. But even outside wedding night rituals, the presence of others was constant. Servants didn't just clean up and disappear. They were your shadows. A chambermaid might sleep at the foot of your bed, or on a pallet nearby. Young pages often curled up on benches, snoring softly while their masters whispered behind curtains. Even when you tried to have a discreet moment of intimacy, someone was usually close enough to hear the rustle of sheets and maybe even take notes for gossip later. No wonder castle rumour mills were always churning. This is where it gets thorny. Noblewomen, in particular, had their reputations built or broken by what people thought they might be doing behind closed doors. And since nothing was really closed, everything became suspect. If a woman spent too much time with a handsome page, if she smiled too warmly at a visiting knight, if she requested a certain song one too many times at a feast, whispers began. Letters were sent. Confessions were pressured. One suggestive comment could spiral into full-blown scandal. And this brings us to one of the big scholarly debates about castle life. Did nobles actually want more privacy, or did they just not conceive of life that way? Some argue that our modern obsession with personal space is just that, modern. Medieval people may have simply accepted constant company as the norm. Others, however, suggest that noble lovers did seek out secret corners, hidden alcoves, and coded letters to create pockets of intimacy within a very exposed life. There's even archaeological evidence of small whispering chambers or hidden passages in some castles, possibly used for sneaky conversations or sneakier rendezvous. There's also the matter of etiquette. You couldn't just walk into someone's chamber unannounced. Unless you were the king, then you could walk in anywhere. But the line between polite entry and barging in was thinner than the paper some of these castles were metaphorically built on. Knocking might consist of clearing one's throat loudly and waiting half a second. Doors were opened and closed frequently, sometimes by accident. And with guards and servants always nearby, your whispered declarations of love might have a not-so-silent audience. Let's paint a picture. You and your lover are lying in bed, cloaked by darkness, breathing in sync, the air smelling faintly of beeswax and yesterday's fire. You reach for each other, murmuring soft words in the hush of night. Then the door creaks open, and a servant enters with a jug of wine, pauses, apologizes, but only slightly, and sets the jug down with a loud clunk. Mood broken. You try to continue. The dog at the foot of the bed starts licking itself loudly. One of the pages coughs. Someone out in the hall yells something about a horse being missing. You sigh. So does your partner. Romance, medieval style. That doesn't mean people gave up, though. Humans are nothing if not adaptable. Secret gestures, nighttime walks, coded poetry, and small stolen moments were how affection survived. Even the most exposed lovers found ways to create bubbles of intimacy. A touch under the banquet table, a stolen kiss behind the stables, a sigh shared by candlelight as the world swirled around them. You learn to navigate the noise, to find passion in brief glances and whispered jokes that only two people in the room understand. And maybe that's the heart of it. While the castle's walls were thick and cold and the rooms were never really empty, desire found a way. It always does. Because even when your bed is 6 feet wide, your in-laws are listening from the corridor, and your dog is chewing on someone's slipper in the corner, you still crave connection. You still want to be seen, not just in the political sense, but in the real one. And if you're lucky, someone sees you back, even in the candlelight flicker, even in a place where privacy is practically illegal. By the time the sun fully lifts above the castle walls and casts golden light across the uneven floor, the air inside is already warming with movement. Footsteps echoing in corridors, the shuffle of skirts, the faint scrape of pots being scrubbed in the kitchens below. But here in your chamber, something different is brewing. Steam. A bath is being drawn, and not just for hygiene, which, let's be honest, was more occasional than regular. No, today's bath feels a little more intentional, a little more preparatory. Bathing in the medieval world is more complicated than we like to imagine. Yes, people bathed. But it wasn't as simple as turning on a tap and slipping into bubbles. First, servants haul in bucket after bucket of hot water, heated over open flames in the kitchens. Then they fill a large wooden tub that looks more like a wine barrel cut in half. If you're lucky, it's lined with a linen sheet or some herbs to soften the water, and the smell, and if you're really lucky, you're not alone. Communal bathing wasn't just for the peasants. Nobles enjoyed it too, and not always in the most, shall we say, chaste ways. In some castles, especially in France and southern Europe, private bathhouses were carved into the stone itself or tucked away in warm corners of the keep. Couples bathed together, sometimes with musicians playing in the background, servants ladling warm water over their shoulders, and perfumed oils floating on the surface like lazy petals. This wasn't just cleaning, it was prelude. And oh, the ingredients tossed into those medieval stews: lavender, chamomile and rosemary for scent, vinegar or milk for skin softening, sometimes even ground-up herbs thought to spark desire, like wild thyme or vervain. The line between a bath and a love potion was blurred at best. If your lover stepped into the tub with you, slippery with oil and steam curling around your necks, it wasn't about rinsing off the day's dust. It was about what came next. That brings us to a fun and mildly chaotic historical tidbit. There are recorded instances of noble couples throwing literal bath parties. Picture this: tubs placed side by side in a private chamber, guests seated in the nude, nibbling on fruit and sipping wine while minstrels played soft music. The atmosphere, somewhere between a modern spa and a very awkward double date. There's even speculation that some of these bathing feasts turned into low-key orgies, though as always the line between scandal and fact in medieval records is murky at best. Either way, it's clear that the bathhouse wasn't exactly G-rated, but cleanliness, despite the erotic potential, was still seen through the lens of morality. The church had complicated feelings about it. On one hand, washing the body was considered virtuous, especially before holy days or ceremonies. On the other, too much pleasure in the process, especially if you were naked and laughing and possibly splashing around with someone else's spouse, was frowned upon. By the later Middle Ages, this tension intensified. Public bathhouses, especially in cities, got reputations as dens of sin. In fact, many eventually doubled as brothels, blurring the line between health and hedonism entirely. And while we're getting steamy, here's where scholars start to argue. Was the erotic use of baths a widespread noble custom, or a rare indulgence reserved for the very elite? Some say these luxurious bathing rituals were limited to courts with strong Mediterranean influence, places like Sicily or the Iberian Peninsula, where Muslim and Byzantine traditions filtered into Christian nobility. Others argue they were more common than we think, but simply underdocumented due to the Church's disapproval. After all, when monks are writing the history books, they're not exactly cataloguing the bath party guest list. But the baths weren't always mutual. Often women bathed alone, watched and helped by female servants who scrubbed, rinsed and dried every inch with care. And while that might sound kind of relaxing, remember, everything in a noblewoman's life was performative. Even her bath could be a staged display of grace, beauty or readiness. If a husband chose to join her, it might be because the mood called for it, or because he was bored, or because he wanted to assert his right to her body in that moment. Choice, as usual, was a slippery concept. There's also the matter of scent. In a world without deodorant, shampoo or reliable laundry, scent mattered. A lot. Herbal waters, floral tinctures, and infused oils weren't just for indulgence. They were the medieval answer to masking everything from sweat to week-old linen. Before a romantic encounter, both men and women might dab themselves with rosewater, mint extract, or even ambergris, yep, that's whale puke, to appear more alluring. Smelling like someone's garden was an asset. Smelling like the stables, less so. And then there's the drying ritual. No fluffy white towels here. Just rough linens, maybe warmed by the fire, and the occasional fanning by a servant if you were feeling extra regal. Getting dried off could be sensual, ceremonial, or just awkward, depending on who was doing the drying and how closely they were staring. Sometimes it was a chance for flirtation, eyes meeting through the steam, fingers grazing wet skin. Other times, it was all business. Wipe, pat, done. Next. Imagine stepping out of your tub, Skin warm and soft, hair dripping, a fire crackling nearby. You're wrapped in thick linen, sipping wine from a pewter goblet. A servant hands you a comb. Your partner leans against the stone wall, watching with a little too much interest. The room smells like rosemary and something faintly musky. You don't speak. You don't need to. The bath has done its work. The heat, the ritual, the vulnerability, it's all foreplay, medieval edition. Of course, not all castle baths were seductive. Sometimes they were just plain uncomfortable. Water cooled quickly, drafts slipped through walls, and if you were too slow, the tub got cold and slimy. Bathing in winter meant bracing for a chill that no amount of fire could fight, and for all the luxury it was still hard work, especially for the servants who had to clean the tub afterward, dump the water, and scrub out whatever floated to the bottom. Sexy? Maybe not for everyone involved. Still, the bath offered a rare moment of transformation. You entered dusty, stiff and armoured, figuratively or literally, and emerged soft, scented and open to possibility. Whether that possibility was romantic, ritualistic, or just a good night's sleep depended on what followed. But either way, the bath served as a kind of doorway, one step closer to intimacy, one layer of grime, physical or emotional, washed away. So next time you imagine medieval castle life as all grit and grit alone, remember this. Behind those thick stone walls, someone was soaking in a steaming tub, surrounded by candlelight and lavender, preparing for a night that was anything but cold. The fire crackles low now, casting a reddish glow across the chamber walls as you ease yourself back onto the bed, skin still warm from the bath, linen gown clinging in places it didn't before. You feel cleaner, maybe even alluring, but you also feel the weight of something heavier pressing in. A strange, suffocating expectation. Because for all the steamy tub rituals and romantic possibilities, one thing keeps resurfacing: virginity. Not the idea of it, but the full-blown cultural obsession that clung to it like mildew on those cold stone walls. Virginity wasn't just a concept in medieval castle life. It was currency, contract and political asset. For noblewomen, it could determine their entire future. Your body wasn't just yours. It was your family's honour, your father's bargaining chip, your kingdom's investment. And the closer you got to marriage, the more your virginity was scrutinised, guarded, and frankly hyped up like it was some kind of holy relic. No pressure, right? If you were a noble daughter, your virtue had been under surveillance since basically puberty. Governesses, older relatives, and sometimes even paid guards kept an eye on you. You weren't allowed to walk alone in gardens, linger too long near visiting squires, or, God forbid, laugh too hard at a feast joke that involved anything below the belt. Even books were suspect. Too much reading, too much imagination. You might get ideas. And when your marriage was arranged, and it was arranged, you had to arrive at the altar physically intact. Not just metaphorically. There were literal inspections. Midwives, mothers-in-law, and sometimes hired professionals would perform hymen checks before a wedding. Spoiler alert, the science was questionable at best, but that didn't stop people from treating it like gospel. If there was any doubt, the woman could be cast aside, disgraced, divorced, or worse. So yeah, no pressure at all. Just your entire social standing hinging on the integrity of a body part that even medieval medicine didn't fully understand. Now here's a particularly absurd fringe fact for you. Some families were so paranoid about proving virginity that they preserved bed linens from the wedding night, stained or not, as legal evidence. These blood-stained sheets were sometimes paraded around as proof of consummation, hung out like flags of honour. In certain courts, disputes over whether or not a bride had bled could lead to full-scale family feuds. And if the sheets didn't show what people expected, fingers pointed, accusations flew, doctors were summoned. Occasionally marriages were annulled on the basis of one unsatisfying laundry inspection. And this obsession didn't just affect women. Noblemen were expected to uphold certain standards too, though let's be real, the double standards were thick enough to cut with a butter knife. While a nobleman's virginity wasn't policed in the same way, he was still expected to perform, to claim his wife in bed, and ideally to leave physical evidence of having done so. If he couldn't, that reflected on his masculinity, his leadership and his worth as a political player. There are actual medieval records of lords undergoing medical exams to prove they were capable. Yes, that was a thing. But the pressure on noble women was deeper. Virginity was treated like a magical seal that, once broken, transformed a girl into a wife and potential mother. Before that moment, she was expected to be chaste, obedient, and silent. Afterward, she was expected to become a skilled hostess, diplomat, and baby machine. That one act of sex redefined her entire place in the world, and you didn't get to practice beforehand. The stakes were too high. Still, despite all the paranoia, not everyone played by the rules. There are love letters, poems, and veiled records that hint at secret trysts before marriage. Women had ways, risky, clever ways, of exploring desire without getting caught. Sometimes it was as simple as a stolen kiss in a chapel, a hidden rendezvous in the herb garden, or a whispered confession by candlelight. In rare cases, full-blown affairs happened, and if the girl became pregnant, that's where things got medieval. A pregnant unmarried noblewoman was a scandal of epic proportions. She could be sent to a convent, married off in haste to some unfortunate third cousin, or disowned entirely. Her lover, if identified, might be exiled, imprisoned, or killed. Yet paradoxically, the church believed in forgiveness. There were rituals and prayers for the fallen woman, confessions that might save her soul, even if not her reputation. But socially, she was done. Virginity lost outside marriage was like a dropped glass goblet, impossible to put back together, and everyone heard it shatter. Here's the scholarly grey zone. Was medieval obsession with virginity driven more by religion or politics? Some argue it was purely patriarchal control, a way to ensure legitimate heirs and keep wealth consolidated. Others point to church doctrine, which increasingly tied female virtue to spiritual purity, particularly from the 12th century onward. Either way, the result was the same, an entire system where one act, one mistake, could define your life. And don't think the pressure stopped after marriage. If a noble bride failed to get pregnant within a year or two, whispers started. Was she barren? Was he impotent? Was the marriage cursed? Virginity was just the beginning. Once you crossed that line, the expectations only escalated. You went from being a precious, untouched jewel to a baby-making vessel under constant watch. But all this anxiety didn't stop people from romanticising the whole thing. Courtly literature was obsessed with the image of the innocent maiden and the noble knight winning her heart. Then maybe her virtue, in poetic, metaphoric terms. Bards sang songs of longing. Troubadours composed verses about eyes like sapphires and cheeks like roses. These tales danced around the act itself, making sex both sacred and dangerous, a prize and a peril. So now, sitting here in this dimly lit chamber, you start to grasp the full absurdity of it all. Virginity was a construct propped up by superstition, poor science, and social paranoia, but its consequences were very real. For the average noblewoman, sex wasn't about pleasure, at least not at first. It was about survival. Play your cards right and you could become a respected matron. Slip once, and you could lose everything, and you didn't even get to talk about it. No one prepared you. You were just supposed to lie back, think of your lineage, and hope the sheets gave you a decent review. Yet despite the suffocating weight of all this, people still fell in love. They still found ways to desire, to hope, to sneak off when no one was looking. Even in a world obsessed with purity, passion found cracks in the stone. The castle is buzzing. Below the tower chamber, a wedding feast is unfolding with the slow, chaotic grace of a drunken choir. Laughter rings off the stone walls, dogs bark under long wooden tables, and musicians are plucking lutes with slightly off-key enthusiasm. Somewhere, a roast boar is being sliced with a dagger, and people are pretending not to notice that the bride looks like she'd rather be anywhere else. You're not at the feast, though. You're up here, in the upper chamber, where the flickering torchlight casts weird, flickery shadows, and the bed, oh, the bed, has been prepared for witnesses. Yes, you heard that right. This isn't just the couple's first night together, it's the political proof of their union. And while we like to think of honeymoon suites as private sanctuaries, in the medieval world, noble wedding nights could come with an audience, sometimes literal, sometimes just implied, but always looming. You start to understand how wildly public this deeply private thing used to be. Let's start with the bedding ceremony, a wonderfully awkward tradition where guests would escort the newlyweds to their chamber, sometimes physically undressing them, like overly helpful aunts on bath night. The whole group, family, clergy, and sometimes servants, would walk the couple to the bed, make a few jokes, often crude, and then hand them a drink or two to calm the nerves. Sometimes the priest blessed the bed. Sometimes the mother-in-law did. Sometimes a bard sang a song about fertility. Romantic, huh? And just when you think they'll finally be left alone, nope. In certain courts, attendants might stay in the room until the deed was obviously underway. Some left the room but stayed just outside, listening closely. Others waited for the bedsheets to be shown in the morning, checking for signs of blood. Physical proof that virginity was lost and the marriage was consummated. It was a weird combination of legal ritual, religious tradition, and family gossip chain. Because what says romantic moment, like your uncle pacing outside the door hoping to hear you moan? Here's a historical gem that feels almost made up. In the 15th century England, there are records of kings attending the bedding of nobles, just to make sure everything was going according to plan. In France, the court sometimes watched from behind curtains or through cleverly positioned peepholes. And in Scandinavia, witnesses sometimes stayed in the room the whole night, lying silently a few feet away, just in case, for accuracy. The pressure was enormous. If the marriage wasn't consummated, it could be annulled. If a nobleman failed to perform, it wasn't just embarrassing, it was politically dangerous. Rival families could use it as ammunition. The bride could be returned to her father with a smug, "This model was defective." And if she turned out to be pregnant by someone else, well, that was an entirely different flavour of medieval drama. And for the woman, there was a distinct lack of control over any of this. She might be 17 or 12, or in some cases 9, though consummation was usually delayed until puberty, usually not always. Medieval ethics were a little flexible when property was on the line. She might not have even met her husband until a few days before. The marriage was rarely about love, and almost always about land, alliances, or peace treaties. Her job was to produce heirs, full stop. Her body was her dowry, and the wedding night was the receipt. But don't get the wrong idea, some couples found real affection, even love. Letters survive from husbands writing tenderly to their wives, thanking them for their warmth, beauty, or gentle compliance. And some wives wrote back with clever, flirtatious, even affectionate notes, suggesting that not all matches were cold political machinery. There were sparks. Maybe they came later. Maybe they had to be coaxed out between stiff sheets and stiffer expectations, but they were there. Of course, there were also stories where it went completely sideways. One infamous noblewoman locked herself in her chamber for 3 days, refusing to let her elderly husband touch her. In another account, a groom drank so much at the feast that he passed out before reaching the bed. The bride's family demanded a repeat performance the next night, this time with less wine and more results. Now, the whole concept of blood on the sheets as proof of consummation, let's just say it wasn't exactly a foolproof system. Even back then, people knew that not all women bled during first intercourse, but the myth was stronger than the biology. So to avoid scandal, some brides faked it. They pricked a finger, used animal blood, or even smuggled in stained cloths from elsewhere. Because when your future depends on a single stain, you get creative. And then there's the weird fact that this wasn't just about the bride and groom. Their first night had symbolic meaning for the whole kingdom. It represented the joining of houses, the sealing of peace, the future of dynasties. That's a lot to hang on two nervous teenagers who may or may not have any idea what they're doing. But welcome to castle life, where your bedroom was a throne room and your bed a battlefield. This brings us to one of the most hotly debated historical questions. How often were these public bedding ceremonies actually enforced? Some scholars argue they were rare, exaggerated by chroniclers who loved a juicy detail. Others insist they were more common among royalty and high nobility, especially when large inheritances or political power were at stake. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. But even when not physically witnessed, the idea of being observed hung over the bed like a damp tapestry. Imagine yourself there, in that moment. You're sitting on the edge of a bed so high you need a footstool to climb into it. You're wearing a nightshirt made of heavy linen. Your spouse, likely a stranger until yesterday, is trying to untie the sleeves without looking terrified. Outside the door, someone coughs. The fire crackles. You both make eye contact and laugh, nervously, awkwardly, but with some relief. And for a moment, it's just the two of you. Not dynasties, not bloodlines, just two people trying to fumble their way through history. And honestly, that moment might be the most real part of the entire night. You wake the next morning tangled in layers of linen and wool, the air around you still heavy with the scent of last night's fire and a whiff of roasted meat lingering from the feast below. The room is quiet now. The tension of the wedding night ceremony finally lifted, though not entirely gone. Downstairs, servants are sweeping up spilled wine, someone is snoring loudly in the corridor, and a bard is already plucking out a sleepy tune in the great hall. But here in the soft aftermath something shifts. The official duty is done, now the real dance begins. Because as strange as it sounds, once the wedding night spectacle is over and the politics have been sealed with skin, the subtle art of seduction can actually start. And in the medieval castle, seduction didn't usually begin in the bed. It started in the scriptorium, in gardens, during feasts, and in the corners of the court where poets, musicians, and ladies-in-waiting spun a web of romantic intrigue. Quietly, carefully, and always with at least one eye on the church. This was the world of courtly love, a kind of highly stylized poetic romance that was all about emotional longing, dramatic declarations, and not necessarily, at least officially, sex. Think of it like the fan fiction of its time, knights pledging themselves to unattainable ladies, women sending favours like embroidered scarves, and everyone writing breathless verses about sighs and stolen glances. The rules were ridiculous, the feelings, surprisingly intense. You roll out of bed and move to the narrow window looking out over the courtyard. A knight is sparring below, his movements flashy and just slightly exaggerated, because yes, he knows someone's watching. Maybe not you, maybe not today, but someone. In this world, love is a performance, and performances need an audience. The real power of courtly love wasn't in its secrecy, it was in how visible it pretended not to be. A nobleman might spend months crafting poetry for a lady he could never actually touch. A married woman might encourage a younger man's affections through coded language and eye contact. Servants passed notes. Troubadours sang songs with just enough ambiguity to keep the court buzzing. Nothing ever needed to be confirmed. In fact, not confirming it made the whole thing better. Now here's a quirky little wrinkle in the story. The poets who shaped this romantic tradition, troubadours and trouvères, were often lower nobility, or even commoners with talent. These were the original content creators, gifted with wordplay and drama, who were invited to court specifically to stir up emotion. They'd write verses about the noble lady's alabaster throat, or the knight's burning gaze, and everyone in the hall would try to figure out who the song was really about. It was romantic, sure, but also gossip with a lute. One particularly famous example is the 12th century Duchess Eleanor of Aquitaine, who not only encouraged this poetic culture but may have invented whole chunks of it. Her court in Poitiers was basically the medieval version of a writing workshop crossed with a flirtation festival. Women debated the rules of love. Men tried to outdo each other with the most dramatic declarations. Eleanor herself was said to have received, and possibly responded to, love poems from several admirers. And whether or not anything physical happened? Well, we'll never know. That's the beauty of it. But don't let the romance fool you. Behind all the moonlit metaphors and unrequited longing, courtly love served a real function. It gave nobles a way to channel desire without breaking the rules, or at least without appearing to. Married ladies could enjoy attention without risking their reputation, as long as things didn't go too far. Unmarried knights could express devotion without needing to propose, and everyone, regardless of gender, got to play in this highly coded theatre of passion. There's one surviving poem that describes a knight who spends 5 years worshipping a lady from afar before she allows him to hold her hand. And you know what? He acts like he's been given the keys to heaven. That's how intense this ritual could be. But as you've probably guessed, not all those declarations stayed platonic. Behind the metaphors and courtly rules, real affairs happened. The poetry was a curtain. Sometimes it stayed closed, sometimes it parted. This leads us to one of the great scholarly debates. Was courtly love just a literary fantasy, or did people actually live it? Some historians argue that it was pure fiction, designed to entertain and distract from the brutal reality of medieval marriage. Others believe it reflected real emotions, real relationships, just filtered through the constraints of the time. There's even a theory that the whole tradition was a sneaky way for women to gain more agency in love, offering them a script where they held the power, even if only symbolically. And maybe that's the most important part, the illusion of control. In a world where marriages were arranged, sex was duty, and virginity was policed like state treasure, courtly love offered a space for play, for fantasy. It let people feel something, deeply, theatrically, dramatically, even if their actual relationships were stiff and strategic. Back in your chamber, a servant enters with a tray, bread, cheese, and a goblet of watered wine. She sets it down, gives you a knowing smile, and quietly places a folded piece of parchment beside your breakfast. A poem. You don't even have to open it to know what it is. Someone has been watching. Someone, probably dressed in chainmail and entirely too dramatic, has decided you're the inspiration for his next song. You pick it up, read the opening lines, something about eyes like twin moons and a voice that echoes through my soul. It's a little cringe, honestly, but also kind of sweet. And suddenly you're smiling. Because in a world where nothing is private, nothing is simple, and nothing is entirely yours, a bad love poem left on your tray is, weirdly, a little bit perfect. And so, as the sunlight warms the edges of the room and the laughter from the great hall drifts upward, you settle into the idea that seduction in a castle isn't always sweaty or scandalous. Sometimes it's a song in the corridor, a glance across the feast table, or a terrible poem that makes you feel seen. And sometimes that's exactly enough. The corridors are quieter now, the clamour of the morning slipping into the softer rhythm of midday. Somewhere, a tapestry is being beaten free of dust in the courtyard. In the distance, a hawk cries out from the watchtower. You make your way through a narrow stone hallway, guided by instinct more than memory. These castle walls are full of strange passageways, some built for movement, others for secrets, and today you're finally starting to understand just how many stories those stones have swallowed. Castles weren't just fortresses. They were mazes, filled with cleverly disguised exits, whispering corners, and staircases that led nowhere, or led exactly where you hoped they would, if you were lucky enough to know how to use them. You brush your fingers along the wall and pause at a familiar spot, a notch in the stone, a sliver of darkness, and then, with the softest groan, a hidden door slides open, just like in the stories. Because yes, hidden passages were real, and in more than a few castles they were used for more than strategic escape. They were for rendezvous. You slip inside, feeling the air cool and the silence thicken. It's a tight space, barely wide enough for one person, lined with rough stone and smelling faintly of earth and old candles. No one builds a passage like this just to move furniture. These were the arteries of discretion. In a world where privacy was scarce and everything had an audience, these corridors were where secrets lived. Lovers met here. Messengers delivered notes. Sometimes even queens passed unseen to rooms they weren't supposed to visit. This isn't some over-dramatised fantasy either. Real medieval castles, Château de Vincennes, Leeds Castle, Warwick, have documented secret stairwells, hidden doors built into wardrobes, even tunnels that led under moats. Some were meant for escape in times of siege, but some, let's just say they conveniently connected a lady's chambers to a favoured knight's quarters, with a few turns in between to keep the nosy ones guessing. Now here's your odd but true historical nugget. Some noblewomen were rumoured to design these passages themselves, or at least to request them during renovations. There are cases where letters mention a private path, or the quiet way, often referring to a shortcut between wings of the keep that bypassed the public galleries. And while historians can't prove these were built for romance, the placement suggests it wasn't entirely about efficiency, when the quickest way between two rooms happens to avoid every major hallway. That's not an accident, that's strategy. One of the juiciest legends, although, like all good gossip, it comes without receipts, is the tale of a lady who carved a hidden stairway from the chapel to her chambers, supposedly to allow her confessor easier access. Confessor? Right, that's what we're calling him. The story goes that her husband found the passage, but instead of confronting her, he bricked up one end and left the other open, so she could walk into her own trap. Medieval passive aggression at its finest. This leads us into the real meat of the matter. Infidelity in castle life was both a scandal and a game. There were rules, of course. Adultery could be punished harshly. Loss of status, exile, even execution in extreme cases. But punishment depended heavily on your rank, gender, and whether you got caught in a politically inconvenient moment. For noblemen, affairs were often overlooked unless they led to children or public disgrace. For women, the stakes were much higher, yet even with those risks, lovers found ways. Notes were hidden in books. Tokens, gloves, brooches, rings were passed under tables or sewn into clothing. A song sung at a feast might carry a double meaning. One glance held too long could be an invitation. and when everything aligned, you met in the passage. But here's the thing, just because the passage was hidden didn't mean no one noticed. Servants talked, pages gossiped, guards who looked the other way usually had a reason, and that reason usually involved coin or blackmail. Some of the most infamous medieval scandals started because a servant didn't shut up. Or a rival noblewoman had enough of someone else getting the attention. Secret doors weren't as silent as people hoped. Yet for all the risk, these moments, these stolen seconds behind the walls, were sometimes the only freedom castle residents had. A lady locked in a political marriage might find 1 hour of joy with a man who actually looked her in the eye. A squire tired of pretending could laugh finally with someone who made him feel real. These corridors, dark and narrow and damp as they were some of the only places where love had room to breathe. There's an open question among scholars about just how common these encounters were. Were medieval castles truly brimming with secret affairs, or are we reading too much into a few spicy chronicles? Some historians argue that most of these stories are exaggerations, shaped by later writers looking to spice up dry political narratives. Others point to the sheer number of cautionary tales, legal disputes, and sudden imprisonments to argue the opposite. That illicit romance was practically baked into the blueprint of noble life. When you stuff too many powerful, frustrated people into one stone box and give them zero hobbies, things happen, and sometimes those things shaped history. A well-placed affair could shift alliances, delay wars, or produce an inconvenient heir. There are kings who may have been born of these secret meetings, and queens whose influence grew from whispers exchanged on narrow stairs. Love, in its rawest form, was a tool, and sometimes a weapon. But in the shadows, it was also something softer, a reprieve, a rebellion, a breath of air in a world too tightly laced. You reach the end of the passage now, pressing a small stone that clicks under your fingers. A panel opens into another chamber, this one unused, forgotten by most. Dust floats in the sunlight slanting through the shutters. There's a cot in the corner, a candle burned low on the sill, and a carved name in the wood beam above. A reminder that someone was here before you, waiting for a knock or a whisper or a hand in the dark. You sit for a moment in the quiet. No audience, no performance. Just the weight of stone above and below, and the sense that you're not the first to feel both trapped and electrified by what this castle allows, and what it doesn't. The walls are thick, yes, but they don't keep everything out, and they certainly don't keep everything in. The next evening rolls in slow and thick, like honey poured over stone. Outside, the air is heavy with the smell of wood smoke and damp wool, and inside, the castle settles into that strange rhythm it always falls into after dark, half holy, half hungry. You pass by the chapel on your way back from the feast, just in time to catch the end of Vespers. The monks are chanting, and it echoes beautifully off the vaulted ceiling. The smell of incense curls around your head like a fog, and for a moment you feel a twinge of guilt. Not for anything you've done, necessarily, but for what you might do. Because tonight we're talking about what the church really thought about sex in medieval castles, and spoiler, it was complicated, and weird, and honestly, kind of hilarious. First off, let's get one thing straight. The church had a lot to say about sex, and not just whether it was sinful or not, they got into the details. We're talking full-on instruction manuals disguised as moral guidance. You wouldn't think a bunch of monks would spend so much time cataloguing which positions were holy and which were hell-worthy, but oh, they absolutely did. According to various medieval penitentials, those handy little books priests used to assign confessions, there were exactly 2 acceptable reasons to have sex: procreation and, well, actually that was it. Just procreation. Desire, sinful, enjoyment, highly suspicious. Mutual orgasms? Let's not even go there. In fact, one of the most quoted medieval sex rules, and you cannot make this up, was that couples should abstain from sex on Wednesdays, Fridays, Saturdays, Sundays, before communion, during Lent, Advent, feast days of saints, fast days, the night before any major holiday, and oh yes, during pregnancy or menstruation, which leaves you with approximately 3 acceptable Tuesday nights a year, assuming you weren't already too exhausted from praying about how sinful it all was. Now, in theory, the church's influence was all-encompassing. Bishops could excommunicate kings, priests advised nobles on morality. The confessional was a place where even queens might have to admit to ungodly lust. But in practice, things were flexible. Noblemen especially had a knack for separating religious duty from bedroom activity. There are letters from popes scolding kings for keeping mistresses, but rarely do those letters lead to much beyond a vague apology and a promise to do better, followed of course by a second mistress. Sometimes the pope was the one with a mistress. Still, the church tried its best to set the tone. One text claimed that sex in any position other than missionary was an abomination before God, and that if you dared do it while standing up or, brace yourself, from behind, demons would literally enter the room. Imagine finishing a night of passion and turning over to find Beelzebub giving you a slow clap in the corner. And yet, despite all the fire and brimstone rules, erotic texts managed to survive. Hidden away in monastic libraries were Greek and Roman works on love, some of which were fairly explicit. Monks copied Ovid's Ars Amatoria, blushing, probably, but preserving it nonetheless. Occasionally pages were torn out or scribbled over in Latin warnings like, "This is not for the weak of soul," but the fact that they were preserved at all tells you something. Curiosity, it seems, was stronger than fear. Even within castle walls, people found ways to read between the lines. A noblewoman might own a book of poetry that looked religious but contained sly double meanings. A knight might attend mass, then slip away to meet his lover behind the stables, justifying it by telling himself that love, too, was a kind of holy passion. One chronicler even records a bishop who, after giving a sermon on chastity, was caught in a compromising position with his scribe. The record ends with the phrase, "He retired from public life shortly after." I'll bet he did. There's a fascinating debate among scholars about just how seriously people took these religious rules. Was medieval society genuinely repressed by church doctrine, or did most people treat it like a suggestion with loopholes? Some argue that the fear of hell was real, visceral and omnipresent. Others say people, especially the elite, learned to perform piety in public and indulge in private. Confess your sins on Sunday, sin again on Tuesday, repeat. The confessional made it possible to live two lives at once. And then there were the sex manuals. Yes, actual medieval sex manuals. One of the most infamous is the Secretum Secretorum, which included advice on aphrodisiacs, timing, and even desirable positions, though it tried to frame everything in medical terms, not pleasure. There's also De Secretis Mulierum, a bizarre blend of gynecology, astrology, and magical thinking that tried to explain how female pleasure worked. Spoiler, it got most of it hilariously wrong. Still, the fact that these works existed at all means people were asking questions the church couldn't quite smother. Here's a fringe fact to keep in your pocket. Some priests were expected to inspect married couples if infertility was suspected, just to make sure they were doing it right. This could involve extremely uncomfortable interviews or, in rare cases, physical examination. Imagine a sweaty cleric with bad teeth leaning over your bed, asking if you've been placing your loins properly. Yeah, that happened. And then there's the strange contradiction. While the church condemned lust, it also celebrated fertility. Noblewomen were praised for becoming pregnant quickly, noblemen for fathering many children. So sex was simultaneously sacred and shameful. You needed it for heirs, but were expected to feel awful about enjoying the process. This tension bled into art, literature, even architecture. Some cathedral carvings show contorted figures in sexual poses, supposedly as warnings, but they're a little too detailed not to raise eyebrows. And tucked into the margins of illuminated manuscripts, right next to saints and dragons, you'll sometimes find naked figures doing very non-sanctified things, drawn by monks who apparently had a sense of humour after all. You return to your chamber, the glow of the torchlight warm against your face, and you can't help but marvel at how people managed to carry so much guilt and so much desire at once. How they confessed with trembling lips and then crept down secret passages after dark. How they feared hell but still passed love notes beneath the altar cloth. And how even under the shadow of the church, they found ways to want, to seek, and to feel. Because in the end, the castle was a place of contradictions, stone and silk, holiness and hunger. And while the church might have tried to control what happened in the bedrooms of nobility, it couldn't quite contain what burned beneath the skin. The afternoon sun slants lazily through the narrow windows, dust motes spinning in the air like bits of gold leaf. And somewhere outside in the lower courtyard, a baby is crying. Loudly, relentlessly. And maybe it's just the acoustics, or maybe it's the centuries of layered irony clinging to these walls, but the sound feels weirdly appropriate. Because today, you're thinking about what happens after sex in medieval castles. Not the politics or the poetry, but the result. The fallout. The crying, squirming, drooling result. That's right, we're talking wet nurses. Now, on the surface, this doesn't sound particularly sexy, but bear with it. Because in the twisting, chaotic social web of medieval nobility, breastfeeding wasn't just about nutrition. It was about power, class, sex, suspicion, and the kind of bizarre intimacy that would make even the most jaded nobleman squirm. To start with, noble women, especially the wealthy, politically visible ones, rarely nursed their own children. It wasn't about laziness, or squeamishness, or even convenience. Though, let's be real, it was more convenient to hand off the 3 a.m. feeding to someone else. It was about fertility. Medieval medical theory claimed that nursing delayed a woman's ability to conceive again. Something about her maternal humours being distracted, or her body being too busy making milk to prepare another heir. And in a world where noble women were expected to pop out as many children as physically possible, ideally boys, anything that delayed that next pregnancy was considered a political liability. Enter the wet nurse, often a lower-class woman, sometimes the wife of a servant or minor noble, chosen specifically for her health, temperament, and, this is key, the size and quality of her breasts. That's not a euphemism. Letters survive in which noble families very seriously discuss the ideal traits of a woman who would be nursing their baby. She needed to be soft, calm, pious, and preferably pretty enough to not upset anyone, but not too pretty, lest she become a distraction. And oh boy, did that happen. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. The wet nurse's role often straddled the line between caregiver and object of sexual intrigue. She was brought into the most private parts of the household, sometimes even sleeping in the same chamber as the child's father, especially if the mother was away, or ill or dead, which unfortunately happened a lot. These women were often young, physically healthy, and, most notably, recently pregnant themselves. You do the math. There are enough recorded incidents of lords sleeping with wet nurses that it became something of a trope. Whispered accusations, bastard children, jealous wives. This wasn't an anomaly, it was a pattern. And some women, knowing the kind of attention their role could invite, leaned into it. Others had no choice in the matter at all. One court document refers to a nobleman who took comfort from the woman who suckled his son, which is a truly medieval way of saying he got her pregnant while his wife was recovering from childbirth. This is where things get messier. Because once a wet nurse entered the household, she often became entangled. She might nurse not just one baby, but several, sometimes even the lord's illegitimate children alongside his legitimate ones. That created a strange sibling bond between noble heirs and the sons and daughters of servants, and sometimes these relationships lingered into adulthood. A lord might keep his former wet nurse in his household until she died. Some left them property, some married them off strategically, others didn't let go at all. Now, this didn't go unnoticed. Church officials and physicians were deeply uncomfortable with the whole situation. Not necessarily because of the sexual politics, though that did come up, but because of this lingering medieval fear that milk carried moral character. Yes, really. The idea was that a wet nurse didn't just pass along nutrition, she passed along temperament, class, and even sin. If a woman was greedy, gossipy, or lustful, her milk might make the child grow up the same way. So there were entire manuals on how to choose a good, wet nurse, which again involved a lot of extremely specific breast evaluations and moral guesswork. And here's your weird little fringe fact. Some noble families were so paranoid about milk morality that they demanded their wet nurses abstain from sex while nursing. Like, completely. The belief was that if she had sex, her milk would spoil. So not only was she expected to raise someone else's child and be available night and day, but she also had to stay celibate. Meanwhile, the man of the house was sneaking into her room like this was all part of the perks package. The situation created a class of women who were physically intimate with the family, but always a step away from real inclusion. They were insiders and outsiders at once, and their bodies, like the noble women's they technically replaced, were watched, judged, and politicized. If the baby grew up strong, she was praised. If the child fell ill or, God forbid, died, she might be blamed, dismissed, or punished. Even more complex was the bond between noble women and their children's wet nurses. Some women felt genuine affection, even trust. Others resented their presence. There are letters from noble ladies begging their husbands not to keep the wet nurse too close, not to speak with her so gently, not to visit her chamber after dark. It wasn't just jealousy. It was fear of being replaced, not just in bed, but in the heart of their own household. And yet, for all the drama, the wet nurse was essential. She allowed noble women to return to their social roles, hosting feasts, managing estates, making more heirs. She was part of the machinery that kept the castle running, silently absorbing the physical burdens of motherhood so the noble class could keep doing noble things. She existed in that intimate shadow space where sex, power and care all blurred together. This leads us to a long-standing scholarly debate. Did wet nurses wield quiet power within the noble household, or were they simply used and discarded? Some historians point to the influence they held, raising the next generation, forming lifelong bonds, sometimes even shaping political alliances through those bonds. Others argue that they were ultimately expendable, used until their milk dried up, then sent away with a small purse and a prayer. The truth, of course, lies somewhere in between. Back in your chamber, the sound of that crying baby still floats through the air. You picture the nurse rocking the child, humming a song older than the castle itself. She's young, but her eyes are tired. She knows her place, and its dangers. But she also knows something the noblewoman upstairs doesn't. She's fed the Lord's heir. She's touched him when no one else could. She's seen him vulnerable, even tender. And in a world where power lives in every glance, every touch, every bodily exchange, that kind of intimacy, however quiet, never disappears completely. You're in the castle armoury of all places, standing near a rack of polished helmets and a pile of chainmail that smells like iron and sweat, and you're trying to keep a straight face as one of the younger squires, voice cracking with enthusiasm, tells you about chastity belts. His eyes are wide, his hands mimic turning a tiny key. There's mention of spikes, maybe even rust. And you nod, trying not to smirk, because honestly, it's time we had a talk about one of history's most persistent, most misrepresented and most misunderstood inventions, the so-called chastity belt. Let's get this out of the way fast. They weren't nearly as common as people think. That image we all have in our heads of a padlocked metal contraption slapped onto some poor noblewoman before her husband heads off to the Crusades. Almost entirely a later fantasy. Most physical examples of chastity belts we have today come from the 16th century or later, and many were created during the Victorian period. Not for actual use, but as warnings about the dangers of female sexuality. Or worse, as jokes. Yes, literal museum gag gifts. The reality of medieval sexuality was a lot more layered and way less shiny. First off, can you imagine trying to wear a metal undergarment for weeks, months, or even years? In the heat, on horseback, with no antibiotics. Infection would have taken you out long before adultery ever had the chance. That alone should tell you how unlikely widespread use really was. That said, the idea of controlling a woman's sexuality, that was very real. Whether through strict surveillance, locked doors, veiled threats, or social expectations, medieval nobles, particularly men, did everything they could to manage the bodies of the women in their lives, and chastity belts, whether mythical or marginally real, were just a steel-tinted symbol of that obsession. Here's a quirky little historical oddity. The first recorded mention of a chastity belt-like device appears in a 14th century manuscript called Bellefortis by Conrad Keyser. He included a sketch of a metal belt labelled as for the protection of women when their men are away at war. But even he didn't seem to take it too seriously. It's tucked between other inventions like mechanical claws and siege weapons, and the drawing has this weird cartoon energy, like even he knew it was half fantasy. Scholars think it was more of a satirical entry than an actual product catalogue. Still, the idea stuck, especially in later centuries when sexual paranoia skyrocketed. By the time the Renaissance rolled around, the chastity belt had taken on a kind of cultural afterlife, featured in plays, art, and weird little moral fables, always used as a device to highlight the tension between trust and control. She'll stay faithful, the belt seems to say, or she'll be impaled from the inside out. Nothing says romance like a pelvic torture device. There are even 18th century travelling exhibitions, proto-museums really, that featured chastity belts as curiosities. They display them alongside shrunken heads and medieval execution tools, claiming they were authentic relics of the Age of Honour, and people ate it up, especially Victorians, who were both obsessed with purity and deeply repressed, which is never a good combo. But let's entertain the possibility that some chastity belts might have been used, not regularly, not comfortably, and probably not effectively, but used nonetheless. In those rare cases, they may have functioned less as physical barriers and more as psychological ones. A message, a threat, a reminder, something to put fear in the mind of the wearer. Not, you physically can't cheat, but you better not think about it. And then there's the kink angle. Yes, you heard me. Because at least a few of the surviving chastity belts found in European collections are so absurdly complex, so deliberately aesthetic, that it's hard not to see them as erotic artifacts rather than tools of oppression. Some have hearts carved into the metal, or filigree designs. One even has Latin phrases etched around the waist. Playful, cheeky things, not moral scoldings. They look less like instruments of torture and more like props from a Renaissance-themed bondage night. That's led to a whole branch of scholarly debate. Were chastity belts ever used voluntarily, as fetish objects, as part of roleplay, or as symbols of loyalty between lovers? While the evidence is patchy, it's not impossible. Just as today's most repressive symbols can be reappropriated, it's entirely plausible that in a few private chambers, a chastity belt wasn't a curse, it was a game. Still not comfortable, still not hygienic, but maybe consensual. The real question, though, is this. If chastity belts weren't actually strapped onto noblewomen left alone in towers, why do we still believe they were? Why does this image of the locked-up virgin, the padlocked pelvis, persist so strongly in our cultural imagination? Probably because it taps into the oldest, juiciest medieval drama, control versus desire. Who owns a woman's body? Who gets to decide what happens to it when she's out of sight? The chastity belt is a symbol that makes those questions literal. It's absurd, it's graphic, it's unforgettable. It's the kind of thing that grabs the imagination and holds on tight, even if history doesn't support the hype. Back in your chamber, you glance toward the wooden wardrobe. For a moment, you imagine opening it and finding one of those infamous belts hanging from a peg, its metal glinting coldly in the torchlight. You imagine the weight of it, the clumsy way it would sit, the sheer discomfort of walking, sitting, existing, while locked inside something designed by someone who had no intention of wearing it. And then you remember what women actually wore beneath their dresses. Linen shifts, layered undergarments, belts of fabric, not steel, tied with care, not locked with keys. In real castle life, chastity was guarded not by hardware, but by surveillance, expectations, and the constant presence of other people. Servants, parents, advisors, all there to watch, to whisper, to judge. The belt, it wasn't iron, it was social. Still, the myth lingers, and maybe that's the scariest part, that in a world where women were already heavily controlled, where they were married off young, monitored constantly and judged for every breath, the idea of a literal chastity belt didn't seem so far-fetched, that we can imagine it says more about the reality of their lives than the object ever could. So no, you probably won't find one in your dresser drawer tonight, but the idea that someone's virtue could be locked away, clamped down, turned into a symbol that still echoes through the corridors of the mind. Just another way a castle, for all its splendour, sometimes felt like a cage. You pass through the cloister garden on your way to the outer wall, the sun just starting to dip behind the far towers. The air smells of sage and fading roses, and the gravel crunches gently underfoot. To your left, a nun is bent over a patch of herbs, humming a hymn as she works, her coif tight beneath her veil. She looks serene, maybe even holy. But there's something about her smile, just the faintest twitch of amusement, that suggests she knows exactly what you're thinking, and she's not about to correct you. Because tonight we're heading past the noble's bedchamber and down the side corridors of medieval desire, right into the cloisters and abbeys, where supposedly celibate souls lived, and sometimes broke their vows in spectacular fashion. Welcome to the very not-so-secret world of monastery mischief. Let's get this out of the way. The church preached celibacy. Hard. Monks and nuns took vows of chastity that were supposed to strip them of all worldly desire. Their bodies were meant to belong to God. But as you've probably guessed by now, medieval humans were still, well, human. And temptation had a way of sneaking in under even the thickest stone walls. Now some took their vows seriously. Plenty of religious figures lived lives of devotion, never so much as glancing sideways at another person, but others. Let's just say the archives are littered with exceptions. Reports of sexual scandals involving monks and nuns go back centuries, and they weren't all whispered rumours. Some were full-blown court cases, papal investigations, and local crises that sent entire monasteries into chaos. One 14th century document details an abbess who kept not one, not two, but 3 lovers in her private cell hidden behind a false wall. When discovered, she argued, quite boldly, that her spiritual life wasn't hindered in the slightest by her physical activities. Bold take, honestly. The church disagreed, of course. She was excommunicated, the lovers were punished, and the monastery was reconsecrated, as if to burn the memory away with incense and Latin. This wasn't just a one-off either. Monastic communities were often co-ed. Separate buildings for monks and nuns, sure, but still within walking distance, and they walked. In some regions, particularly France and Italy, visiting between houses was so common that bishops had to issue repeated warnings about fraternization. One record from England mentions monks climbing the abbey walls at night and sneaking into the nunnery like it was some kind of holy rom-com, minus the comedy and the holiness. Here's a fringe fact that's almost too good. Some monasteries had secret tunnels between the men's and women's quarters. Officially, these were for safe passage during war or disease. Unofficially, they became well-trodden paths after dark. One particularly dramatic scandal in the 13th century involved a monk getting stuck, physically stuck, in a tunnel during a storm, only to be discovered halfway between destinations when the walls collapsed around him. He survived. His career in the church did not. But why did these transgressions happen so often? One reason might be sheer proximity. When you take a bunch of young, literate, often aristocratic people, put them in close quarters, forbid them from physical contact and give them a bunch of spare time, well, you're just asking for some Shakespearean nonsense. These weren't all crusty old hermits. Many monks and nuns were teenagers or 20-somethings pushed into religious life by their families. Not everyone took the habit by choice, and sex aside, emotional intimacy was rampant. Letters survive between nuns that are deeply affectionate, sometimes romantic, sometimes outright erotic. A few of these letters describe kisses, dreams, longings. One nun in the 1100s wrote to her companion, "I feel your absence like hunger in my belly, and when I press the cloth you left behind, I press it to my lips." That's not just spiritual bonding, that's longing. Which brings us to the messy topic of same-sex relationships in the monastery. While homosexuality was officially condemned by church doctrine, it also existed in a strange grey zone inside cloistered communities. Brotherhood and sisterhood were celebrated. Intimacy was encouraged in a controlled way, and occasionally those bonds grew deeper. Did it always become sexual? Not necessarily. But the intensity was there, and sometimes so was the physicality. Historians still debate this. Were monastic same-sex relationships quietly tolerated, or were they ruthlessly punished? The answer depends on the era and the region. Some were ignored, others punished harshly, especially when discovered by outside authorities. But within the walls, the rules bent, the silence helped, and the deep emotional connections between cloistered souls sometimes took forms that surprised even them. Now, monks weren't innocent either. Some kept lovers from the outside world, servants, villagers, even nobles who funded the abbey in exchange for spiritual favours. Some monasteries became havens for illicit liaisons, so much so that visiting bishops would schedule surprise inspections to see who was actually living there and who had quietly moved in, under suspicious titles like lay visitor or gardening consultant. One Italian abbey was found to be housing more mistresses than monks, and the abbot claimed, without blinking, that they were penitent women recently converted. Right. And yet, for all the hypocrisy, there's a strange tenderness in some of these stories. Monks who broke their vows and then wept for forgiveness. Nuns who loved each other quietly, writing poems in the margins of prayer books. Religious communities that looked the other way because they knew that in a world of arranged marriages, forced vocations and strict hierarchies, this might be the only love their members ever knew. It's easy to laugh at the idea of monks sneaking around in the dark or nuns writing saucy letters, but at the heart of it is something very human. The desire to be close to someone, to be touched, to be seen. And when everything in your world tells you that's forbidden, it becomes not just a desire, but a rebellion. You glance back at the nun in the garden. She's still humming, still smiling to herself. Maybe she's just thinking about the harvest. Or maybe she's remembering a night 20 years ago, a stolen kiss in the vestry, a hand on hers as the bells tolled midnight. The walls of the cloister are high, yes, but they never stopped the heart from climbing over them. Late evening again, and this time you're sitting in the castle's solar, a room meant for warmth, for sunlight, for the kind of soft gathering that doesn't involve weapons or politics. But don't let that fool you. There's tension here too, a different kind. You're surrounded by embroidered cushions, delicate tapestries, and the low murmur of women's voices. A few are stitching, one's writing. Another is staring out the window with a look that says she's not thinking about prayer. She's doing the same math that's haunted women for centuries. Am I pregnant or just bloated from too much barley bread? Because sex in a medieval castle wasn't just about pleasure, power, or performance. It was also about consequences, and none loomed larger than pregnancy. In a world with no reliable birth control, no pee-on-a-stick pregnancy tests, and no real understanding of how conception even worked, every romantic encounter came with a heavy question mark and a whole lot of prayers. Let's start with what people thought they knew. According to medieval medical theory, which was still clinging to the long, slightly confused shadow of Hippocrates and Galen, both men and women were believed to produce seed. That's right. Early ideas of reproduction assumed it took 2 climaxes to make a baby. If the woman didn't orgasm, no seed was released, and thus no child. This little theory did wonders for medieval bedroom diplomacy. Want to avoid pregnancy? Just don't enjoy yourself, feeling guilty about a bastard child. Clearly she climaxed, so it was her fault too. That misunderstanding alone led to some incredibly flawed logic. There are records of rape victims being told their pregnancies proved they had secretly consented, since conception couldn't happen without pleasure. Horrific, yes. But it also laid bare how deeply misinformation and male-centered thinking twisted people's understanding of biology and morality. It's a terrifying example of how science and power played footsie in the dark corners of the castle. And then there was the calendar problem. No one understood ovulation, and menstruation was seen as mysterious, possibly even unclean. Some physicians believed women were more fertile right after their period. Others said it was days later. Some claimed it depended on the phases of the moon, the position of the stars, or what colour shoes you were wearing when you sneezed. It was a mess, and because nobody really knew, women relied on a patchwork of folk wisdom, religious guidance, and desperate guesswork. Here's where things get kind of wild. Medieval birth control did exist, sort of. Not reliably, not consistently, and certainly not FDA approved, but women passed down knowledge in whispers, how to avoid pregnancy, how to delay it, and in some desperate cases how to end it. Herbal concoctions were the go-to method. Pennyroyal, wild carrot, rue, mugwort. Plants that midwives and healers knew could sometimes prevent or disrupt pregnancy. Whether they worked depended on 1,000 factors. Timing, dosage, the body, the planet Mars apparently. Some women tied stones around their waists believed to weigh down the womb. Others drank mixtures of wine and crushed insects. There are even records of placing amulets under the bed made from wolf teeth or wearing talismans with protective prayers etched into lead. The line between medicine and magic blurred fast, and the further you were from the church's direct influence, the more of this knowledge survived. Peasant women in rural areas often knew more about practical contraception than noble women locked behind stone walls and sermon after sermon. But if contraception was unreliable, pregnancy itself was downright terrifying. Even for noble women, who had better nutrition, private chambers, and access to midwives, childbirth was a gamble. You might survive. Your child might not. You might bleed out, go septic, or suffer through days of labour only to deliver a stillborn. And if that child was a girl? Well, congratulations, but your husband was probably hoping for a boy. Try again in a year, assuming you're still alive. Which leads us to the politics of fertility. A noblewoman's value was in her womb. Producing an heir was her job, and until that happened, she lived in a constant state of subtle, smiling pressure. People watched what she ate, noted when she got tired, whispered if she looked fuller around the waist. The entire castle was quietly invested in her cycle, and not because they cared about her health. They cared about succession, about land, alliances, bloodlines. Her body was a vessel for dynastic stability, and the moment it failed, she was replaceable. And let's not forget the men. A nobleman with no heir wasn't just seen as unlucky, he was viewed as less manly. The pressure to produce a child extended both ways, though the blame almost never did. If a woman failed to conceive, the assumption was that she was barren. If a man failed, well, perhaps the stars weren't right, or she wasn't inspiring enough, or he just needed more vigorous riding. Here's your quirky historical side note. Some medieval fertility advice recommended that men eat roasted swan, wear red woolen underwear, or drink wine boiled with hair testicles to increase virility. Women, on the other hand, were told to lie on their back after intercourse, raise their legs, and pray. Honestly, not much has changed. This brings us to a lingering historical question. Did women in medieval castles have more control over their reproductive choices than we assume? Or were they completely at the mercy of their husbands and fate? Some scholars argue that women, especially those with access to educated midwives and herbalists, managed their fertility more actively than we give them credit for. Others believe that any such knowledge was limited, heavily policed, and eventually stamped out by church authority as superstition or witchcraft. Either way, we know this. Women tried. They always tried. You glance around the solar again. The women are still at their embroidery, but the energy has changed. One has her hand pressed low on her belly, another is fingering a charm at her neck, her gaze distant. They don't talk about it openly, not yet, but each of them knows what's at stake when the moon doesn't come on time. Each of them knows the difference between nausea and dread, and each of them is calculating, quietly, methodically, what comes next. Because in a castle full of power, the most powerful secret wasn't whispered in the throne room. It was carried in the belly, hidden beneath embroidered gowns wrapped in hope and fear. A missed period, a second heartbeat, a kick in the night, and suddenly, the entire future shifted. The wind picks up outside, whistling through the castle's arrow slits with a kind of restless energy, like even the stones are getting nosy. You're back in the hall now, watching the fire snap in the grate while two squires argue in hushed tones near the wall. Something about a missing glove, or maybe a belt. The way their voices trail off makes it clear that whatever's gone missing isn't just an accessory, it's a secret, or part of one. Because tonight we're digging into the private, murky, occasionally hilarious underworld of medieval kinks, taboos, and the kind of bedroom behaviour you won't find illustrated in your average history textbook. Let's start with the obvious. People have always been weird. That's not a modern invention. We didn't stumble into 50 Shades of Grey by accident. Humans, from the moment we figured out how to lock a door, have been experimenting with sex in ways that range from the deeply intimate to the completely absurd. And just because medieval nobles were weighed down with layers of velvet and the looming threat of eternal damnation didn't mean they weren't into some very specific things behind closed curtains. In fact, the medieval church's obsession with regulating sex almost encouraged a bit of rebellion. If everything fun is forbidden, then every act becomes a little thrill, and when the rules are that long, that detailed and that invasive, well, you start to look for loopholes, the kind you can squirm through, sometimes literally. So what exactly did forbidden mean back then? According to ecclesiastical texts, sex was supposed to be for procreation only, within marriage, in the missionary position, ideally with minimal talking, on days that weren't Sundays, feast days, fasting days, or Fridays. So, like 3 days a year, assuming you didn't have a headache. Anything outside of that, technically a sin. But sin, as we know, doesn't always stop people. Sometimes it inspires them. There's evidence from court records, medical texts, and confessionals that medieval nobles engaged in a whole range of sexual behaviours we might describe today as kinky. Spanking, role-playing, voyeurism, dressing up, religious-themed fantasy, yep, and even what we'd now call light bondage. One nobleman in 14th century Burgundy was accused, by his furious wife, of making her dress as a peasant girl and call him "my lord steward," while he barked orders at her during intercourse. When he refused to stop, she had the church intervene. He argued that it was part of their domestic ritual. She argued that it was degrading and involved too much yelling. The church was mostly just confused. Now, let's talk about whipping. Yes, it existed, and not just as punishment. Flagellation had a long tradition in religious practice, especially among monks and penitents, but it definitely spilled into the bedroom. There's this blurred line between sacred pain and sensual pain, and medieval writers didn't always know where that line was. There are poems, some anonymous, others cheekily signed, where lovers describe being bound, chastised, or struck with willow branches as acts of passion. These weren't just metaphors. In some noble households it became part of foreplay, wrapped in the language of devotion and penance. "Strike me for my sins," one poem reads, "and forgive me with thy mouth." Subtle it ain't. Another fringe detail: cross-dressing. While strictly forbidden in most public contexts, especially by the church, there are enough wardrobe accounts, letters, and scandalous anecdotes to suggest it happened in private. Noble couples sometimes swapped clothes during masked feasts, but there are darker references to men who insisted their wives dress as boys during intimacy, or vice versa. One bishop recorded a complaint from a lady who found her husband's request to wear his squire's tunic disturbing and profane. He countered that it helped him feel young and unburdened. The bishop told them to sleep separately for a month and pray. There's no note on whether they complied. Then we have role play, which sounds like something invented by bored suburban couples, but was alive and well in the medieval world. With no Netflix and a limited understanding of anatomical detail, nobles let their imaginations run wild. Some reenacted scenes from romances, knights rescuing maidens, lovers fleeing across moors. Others took inspiration from the church in ways that would make a monk choke on his psalter. Confessors, saints, even angels, figures of purity, sometimes became the backdrop for sinful fantasies. And yes, that included costumes, because of course it did. Now, let's not pretend everyone was into this stuff. Many people, maybe even most, were having straightforward, quiet, awkward sex under too many blankets with a fire slowly dying in the hearth, but enough weren't that the historical record is sprinkled with whispers, confessions, and veiled insults that suggest certain nobles were known for their preferences. One infamous case involves a baroness who was accused of hiring a sculptor to craft curious instruments of delight out of ivory and silver. The records don't say exactly what those instruments were, but the list of possible items is short, and the bishop who received the complaint went pale, scribbled something unintelligible, and recommended she focus her passions on gardening. It's unclear whether she took his advice. But her roses bloomed that spring. Even more fascinating is the emerging scholarly debate about how much of this was shameful versus accepted within certain circles. Some historians believe that noble courts, especially in France and Italy, had their own unspoken rules about sexual behaviour. As long as you were discreet, didn't humiliate your spouse in public, and didn't endanger the bloodline with bastards, you could get away with a surprising amount. Others argue that we're romanticising it, that most of these stories come from after someone got caught, and the rest is silence. But that silence, it says a lot. It means people were doing things they didn't write down, or they wrote it in code, or metaphor, or buried it in a joke about a squire's missing glove. There's even a whole genre of medieval riddles, yes, riddles, that are basically just dirty jokes dressed up in allegory. One goes, "I'm long and stiff, and when I rise, maidens open their mouths to take me inside. What am I?" The answer is, a candle. Sure it is. Back in the hall, the squires have moved on, but that quiet tension lingers. The castle is full of stories, and not all of them are chaste. Some are whispered, some are smirked over at dinner, some are carved into the underside of bedposts or hidden in the marginalia of a prayer book, and some never left the chamber at all. Because even behind thick stone walls, even with the church breathing down your neck and propriety watching your every move, people found ways to be strange, to be wild, to be themselves. And maybe that's the real kink. Freedom, even if only for a moment. You're walking along the outer bailey now, just past the kitchen courtyard where the smell of baked onions and boiling cabbage lingers in the cold air like a warning. A servant passes you, arms full of laundry, eyes down. She doesn't speak. No one here does unless they have to. You've left the noble quarters far behind. Gone are the velvet bed curtains and the tapestries of unicorns and saints. Here, sex doesn't happen behind embroidered drapes. It happens in corners, in barns, in shadowed storage rooms when no one is watching. Or sometimes when they are. Because tonight, we're taking a detour from the lords and ladies to look at what the peasants were up to, and spoiler, their sex lives were often freer, bolder, and possibly better. Let's set the scene. The average medieval peasant didn't live in a castle, obviously. They lived in simple one-room huts with mud floors and thatched roofs, usually sharing space with livestock, children, and the occasional extremely bold mouse. Privacy? A joke. You bathed in rivers, shared beds with siblings, and if you had sex, chances are at least one person, and possibly a chicken, was within earshot. And yet, in this exposed, loud, uncomfortable world, many peasants had something noble folk rarely did: autonomy. Unlike their highborn counterparts, most peasants married for practical reasons, yes, but also often for affection. They weren't political pawns. They didn't need to consult 3 bishops and a dowry spreadsheet before getting hitched. If 2 people wanted to be together, they could be, sometimes officially, sometimes unofficially. In fact, medieval Europe had a concept called hand fasting, a kind of informal engagement or common law marriage, which the church only began to crack down on when it realised people were doing it without priests present. Horrifying, truly. Here's a quirky historical gem. Many peasant couples were already cohabiting, or even having children before they were formally married. In some regions, up to a third of brides were pregnant on their wedding day, and no one cared all that much. As long as a couple eventually tied the knot, it wasn't considered scandalous. In fact, producing a child was seen as evidence that the match would be fertile. The logic was almost charming in its bluntness. Why buy the cow if the cow doesn't calve? Compare that to noble women, who were surveilled from puberty, locked in chambers, and examined like prized horses before marriage. Their entire value hung on sexual purity, while peasant women were judged more on whether they could bake, haul firewood, and survive childbirth. Virginity? A bonus maybe, but not a requirement for survival, or love, and sex itself. Rougher, sure, less perfumed, less poetic, but probably more honest. There were no troubadours serenading dairymaids. Okay, maybe the one with a lute and a limp. No courtly love poems carved into the sides of ox carts. But there was affection. There was laughter. There were people grabbing each other in fields and giggling in the hayloft. There was passion that didn't have to perform for politics. And sometimes, that kind of sex, the spontaneous, sweaty, get-caught-by-the-miller kind, was exactly what castle dwellers dreamed about when they stared out the window during Vespers. Of course, it wasn't all sweet stolen moments and haystack kisses. Peasant women were still vulnerable, often more so than noble women, who at least had doors to lock. Sexual assault was a fact of life in a world where power meant everything, and peasants had very little. Lords sometimes exercised droit du seigneur, the supposed right to sleep with a new bride on her wedding night, though whether this was ever widely practiced is debated. Some scholars believe it was more myth than reality. Others argue that something like it happened all the time, just not officially. Power, after all, doesn't need paperwork. Yet despite their hardships, peasant women also had networks of support. Midwives, healers, older women who passed down herbal knowledge that noble women were often too shielded to access. They knew about contraception, how to brew teas that cooled the womb, or insert wool soaked in plant extracts. Did it always work? No, but they were trying, and sometimes they succeeded. In a sense, they had more bodily knowledge than many of the noble women upstairs, who were expected to lie still, produce heirs, and never ask questions. There's a particularly rich account from 14th century Germany that describes a village woman named Greta, who ran what was essentially a sex advice circle out of her home. Local girls came to her for herbal remedies, charms, and practical instruction. She knows the ways of men, one source says, and how to make them go away afterward. Greta was eventually accused of witchcraft, of course, but only after a baron's son knocked up one of her clients. Classic. This leads us to a fascinating scholarly question. Were peasant sex lives more egalitarian than those of the nobility? In some ways, yes. Without the crushing weight of inheritance and dynasty, couples had more space to form based on actual connection. Women might have had less formal power, but in day-to-day matters, they often negotiated consent, cohabitation, and even contraception with more direct control than their cloistered noble sisters. Other scholars push back, noting that poverty creates its own set of limitations, and that survival often outweighed choice. Still, the emotional intimacy in many peasant accounts is striking, raw, relatable, real. And then there's the sheer creativity. Lacking silk sheets and perfumed baths, peasant couples had to make do. An old French poem jokes about using butter as a love aid in the winter and river moss in the summer. Practical, Maybe not, but points for trying. Another account describes lovers using the rhythm of church bells to time their rendezvous, sneaking off during prayers to meet behind the chapel wall, because if you're going to sin, may as well do it on consecrated ground. You walk past the stables now, where two servants are whispering in the shadows. She's smiling. He's fidgeting with the edge of his tunic. You don't need to hear their words to know what's happening. There's no silk, no witnesses, no stained sheets to prove anything. Just two people grabbing a sliver of warmth in a world that offers so little. And somehow, in that barn, in that hay, in the mud and the dark and the thrum of ordinary life, there might be more freedom than anywhere upstairs. The castle herb garden is quiet this morning, surprisingly so. The dew still clings to the leaves, and the smell of crushed thyme and wild mint rises with every step you take between the neat little rows. A sleepy bee circles a flowering fennel stalk. In the corner, tucked behind the high wall that keeps this space shaded and private, an older woman is bent over a wooden table, grinding something with a pestle. She doesn't look up when you approach. She knows you'll speak when you're ready, because this isn't just any garden, and she's not just any gardener. Tonight, or rather this misty morning, we're exploring the secretive world of medieval aphrodisiacs, love spells, and the fine art of magical meddling in other people's desire. First, let's get something out of the way. People in the Middle Ages believed in magic, not in a vague, maybe Mercury's in retrograde kind of way. I mean really believed. Every ache, every storm, every unexplained feeling of lust or heartache had a potential supernatural cause. So it makes perfect sense that love, and especially sex, was a major focus of folk magic. Because when you want someone, and they don't want you back, or when your husband stopped coming to bed, or when you suspect the milkmaid's been smiling a little too brightly at your betrothed, you start looking for solutions. Enter the love potion, the real, bubbling kind. Recipes varied, depending on geography, access to herbs, and just how desperate the client was. But common ingredients included things like basil, lavender, yarrow, anise, and wormwood. Spices believed to heat the blood and stir desire. Some formulas were mild, just herbal teas meant to make someone feel warm and dreamy. Others got darker. Animal parts, bodily fluids, in rare and thoroughly unsettling cases, ground bone or dried blood. Because hey, if you're trying to bend someone's will to yours, subtlety might not be your top priority. And then there were the magical charms, little cloth pouches filled with herbs, tucked into undergarments or sewn into pillowcases, rings inscribed with symbols, wax figures. One surviving manuscript recommends carving your beloved's name into an apple, soaking it in red wine, then burying it under their doorstep, so their thoughts shall turn toward you with hunger. Romantic, rotten, effective. Well, who's to say? But not all magic was used to attract. Some of it was used to prevent. Wives who feared their husband's straying could visit a cunning woman, a folk healer, often older, often living near the edge of the village, and request a spell to keep their man's loins cool. These so-called binding spells were meant to suppress lust, direct affection back to the household, and in a few creative cases cause actual physical dysfunction if the husband tried to stray. Whether it was placebo effect or not, records suggest enough men were terrified of crossing these magical boundaries to tread carefully. Or at least pretend to. Here's your strange but true historical nugget. Some of these women, the ones doling out potions and whispered prayers, kept ledgers. Not formal account books, but coded notes about who requested what. Some of these still exist, stashed in old parish archives or folded between pages of herbals, and they paint a fascinating picture. This wasn't random superstition. It was an underground economy, a social network, a hidden layer of female knowledge passed down through generations. Most noble households had at least one servant or midwife with a foot in both worlds, one hand in the apothecary jar, the other crossing herself just in case the priest was watching. But this world was risky. The church officially condemned all forms of magic, especially when they tampered with love or the body. The idea of using herbs to heal was tolerated, barely, but using them to stir lust, to alter desire, that veered into witchcraft, which in some cases carried a death sentence. Still, the need was too strong. Desire, after all, doesn't care about doctrine. It keeps whispering, and when no one else listens, people whisper back to the herbs. Not surprisingly, most of the people accused of using love magic were women. Folk healers, yes, but also widows, midwives, even the occasional young woman blamed for bewitching a lord's affections. One 13th century trial record describes a baron's wife accusing her maid of slipping a potion into his mead after he started spending more time in the scullery than in their marital bed. The maid was interrogated, her room searched. They found dried valerian root and rose hips. Hardly damning evidence, but enough to cast suspicion. She was dismissed. The lord, naturally, was not questioned. There's a deeper debate among historians about just how powerful these spells were considered to be. Did people really believe in their effectiveness, or were they more symbolic, rituals of comfort and hope? Some argue that love magic was like prayer, a way to feel control over a deeply uncontrollable thing. Others suggest that in isolated communities, where reputation was everything, the threat of magic could shape behaviour even more than the real thing. If people believed you could curse their passion, or ignite it, they treated you with caution, sometimes with fear, sometimes with respect. Back in the herb garden, the woman finally looks up. Her eyes are shrewd, a little amused. She knows what you're thinking. No, she won't show you the strongest recipe, and no, she's not going to cast anything without a fair trade. But she will tell you that rosemary is good for memory, basil for courage, and a little dried damiana under the tongue before a long night can't hurt. She offers you a sprig of sage. For clarity, she says, which may or may not be a polite way of saying don't do anything stupid. You thank her, pocket the sprig and step away, back into the narrow path between the beds of thyme and rue. You glance over your shoulder once, expecting her to vanish like a character in a folk tale. But she's still there, grinding, humming, watching. Because in a castle built on power and performance, where marriages were strategies and love was often a luxury, magic became a kind of rebellion. A quiet one, a secret one, but no less real for that, and somewhere, tucked beneath a noblewoman's mattress or stitched into a knight's doublet, there's a sachet of crushed petals and whispered hope, waiting to do what silk and status alone could not. There's a particular smell in the lower corridor of the castle infirmary, a pungent mix of boiled onions, damp linen, vinegar, and something unmistakably sharp, like copper and mould. You'd think it was just the usual stew of medieval medicine, but tonight there's something more specific in the air. Something festering. Because tonight we're not talking about romance or poetry, we're talking about consequences, sexually transmitted diseases, and the horrifying, occasionally hilarious, and deeply unsettling ways medieval castle life tried, and mostly failed, to deal with them. Let's get uncomfortable. First off, yes, sexually transmitted infections existed in the Middle Ages. Of course they did. People were having sex. People were not great at hygiene. People were sharing beds, sheets, and sometimes partners. And while the term STI didn't exist yet, the symptoms absolutely did. Medieval records are full of descriptions of ailments that can only be interpreted today as syphilis, gonorrhea, chancroid, and possibly other bacterial infections that make you want to light your nether regions on fire. But the most infamous, most mysterious, and most terrifying of them all? The Great Pox, which we now call syphilis. Although scholars still argue over when exactly it arrived in Europe, there's no denying that by the late 15th century, syphilis was absolutely rampaging through noble courts, brothels, monasteries, and yes, castles. It left behind a trail of ulcerated genitals, pockmarked faces, collapsed noses, and eventually madness. And if you were lucky enough to survive all that, you still got to die in horrible syphilitic agony. Good times. But what did medieval people think was happening? Well, that's where it gets weird. They didn't have germ theory, of course. The idea that tiny invisible organisms were crawling around ruining your romantic escapades wasn't even close to existing yet. Instead, they leaned heavily on humoral theory. Your body was made of 4 fluids: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Get those out of whack, and you're in trouble. STIs were often seen as an imbalance of hot and moist qualities, or as divine punishment for lust, or both. Doctors blamed everything from spicy food to bad air to overindulgence in Venus. So how did they treat it? Oh, let me count the horrors. First and foremost, mercury. Yep, mercury. As in the shiny toxic liquid that makes your hair fall out and your organs melt. Physicians believed that mercury could sweat out the disease, so infected patients were locked in steam boxes or lathered in mercury ointment from head to toe. Then they were wrapped in blankets, cooked in front of a fire and left to sweat. For hours, sometimes days. This delightful treatment was known as salivation therapy because it made patients drool uncontrollably, which somehow was seen as a good sign. Needless to say, mercury did not cure syphilis, but it did provide some short-term relief and slowly poisoned patients in the process. There's a certain dark irony in using a fatal metal to treat a fatal disease, but hey, it's not like they had penicillin, and if you were a nobleman desperate to hide your symptoms before a royal banquet, you'd try anything, including being rubbed with a silver spoon until your teeth went soft. Another popular method was bloodletting, because when in doubt, medieval medicine always came back to let's drain them. Leech therapy, lancing, cupping, all were used to try and draw out the corruption. One particularly poetic doctor recommended placing leeches along the root of the man's rod, where the infection begins. Charming. And of course there were herbal remedies, especially among the lower classes and in rural areas where court physicians didn't tread. Parsley, juniper berries, wormwood, myrrh, boiled, mashed, poulticed, and applied in ways I won't describe in detail because this is technically a bedtime history show. Let's just say that if it burned, it was considered promising. And here's a quirky fact to keep you up at night. Some medieval physicians believed that sex itself could be curative. A vigorous bedding was sometimes prescribed to flush out diseased humours, but only with a healthy partner, of course, which when you think about it is exactly how infections spread. There's even a recorded case of a nobleman paying a young servant girl to sleep with him, under the impression that her pure blood would neutralise his illness. She later died. He did not improve, but he did write a very dramatic poem about the experience. Which brings us to the tragic and surprisingly common case of noblewomen contracting venereal diseases from their husbands. Many highborn ladies had no control over their partner's sexual behaviour. If your husband frequented brothels or kept mistresses, and many did, you might find yourself with a disease you didn't earn. There are accounts of noblewomen developing facial lesions, blindness and miscarriages as a result of advanced infections. Some were blamed for it. Others quietly retreated from court life, their reputations mysteriously fading. And yet, despite the horror, these diseases were rarely discussed publicly. In the noble world, it was more shameful to admit you were ill than to actually be ill. The church sometimes framed STIs as divine punishment, particularly for sodomy or extramarital affairs. Confessions were whispered, remedies were hidden, and castle physicians were paid handsomely to keep secrets. Still, there are a few curious examples of kings and lords who left behind extremely detailed medical records, either because they were too powerful to care or because they thought their suffering was somehow noble. One German prince described the burning pustules of my shame in a journal entry so graphic it reads more like fan fiction, written by a medieval mortician. This leads us to an ongoing scholarly debate. Did STIs shape sexual behaviour in medieval society, or were they largely ignored until it was too late? Some historians argue that outbreaks caused temporary dips in promiscuity, particularly in royal courts where succession was at stake. Others believe people just adapted, hiding symptoms, blaming other causes, or just pretending it wasn't happening until their noses fell off. The truth, likely, is both. Fear lurked beneath the surface, but desire? It always found a way. Back in the infirmary corridor, you hear coughing behind the curtain. The healer emerges, wiping her hands. She gives you a look, not unfriendly, but weary. She's seen it all. The nobleman with ulcers on his thighs, the maid with the shaking hands, the whispered request for something to make it go away. She doesn't ask questions. She mixes her salves, lights her candles, and waits. Because tomorrow, another one will come, and another after that. So next time someone tells you that castle life was all lace and honour and chaste glances across the feast table, remind them that the torch-lit corridors carried more than secrets. They carried symptoms, and no matter how tall the tower or thick the curtain, some things can't be hidden forever. It's just after midnight, and the castle has gone nearly still, the kind of hush that only happens when the fires have burned low and even the mice have settled in for the night. You're wandering the upper gallery now, footsteps muffled by centuries-old rugs, the heavy air thick with the smell of wax, stone and sleep. You stop near a carved archway and press your hand to the cold wall. Somewhere beyond it lies another chamber, another story, another secret. And tonight, you're stepping into one of the quietest, yet most persistent mysteries of medieval castle life. Same-sex love behind stone walls. Let's begin with a reality check. Homosexuality was officially condemned in medieval Europe, and the Church made its stance very clear. Sodomy, as it was broadly labelled, was considered a mortal sin, on par with heresy, witchcraft, and sometimes even worse. There were sermons, legal codes, and penitential manuals that outlined harsh punishments, including flogging, penance, public shaming, and in more extreme cases, execution. But like everything else in the medieval world, theory and practice didn't always match. Because here's the thing, people still loved each other. Men loved men, women loved women. And while not every same-sex relationship was sexual, some undoubtedly were, and many more carried an intimacy that defied neat labels, especially in castles, where long hours, close quarters, rigid gender roles and arranged marriages created a petri dish of longing, emotional dependency, and secret desire. Let's start with the women. Noble women often formed intense bonds with their ladies-in-waiting, other noble women, or nuns in nearby abbeys. These were not just friendships, though they were often framed that way, particularly by chroniclers who didn't want to cause a fuss. Letters survive that contain phrases like, "My heart's other half," and "Your breath is the only wind I need." One woman wrote to her companion that she dreamed of curling like a ribbon around her body at night. That's not just a friendship bracelet and a hug. In some castles, these relationships were even structured, tolerated under the term spiritual sisterhoods. The women involved might share a bed, not unusual for the time, pray together, write poetry for one another, and swear lifelong loyalty. In rare cases, they exchanged vows in small, semi-secret ceremonies that mimicked marriage rites, though not legally recognised. Whether or not the relationships were sexual varied, but the emotional intensity? Absolutely real. And what about the men? Well, things get a little more fraught there, because the medieval obsession with masculinity made it far riskier for men to express affection, let alone romantic or sexual desire for other men. Still, that didn't stop it. Pages, squires, knights, young men raised together, trained side by side, sleeping feet apart for years. It doesn't take much imagination to picture how lines blurred, especially when noble marriages were often devoid of emotional warmth, and your closest confidant was the boy who polished your armour and whispered encouragement before battle. In one castle account, a knight was dismissed after being caught in a compromising embrace with a younger page. The record doesn't specify what happened, only that the page screamed, but not in protest. Draw your own conclusions. The knight was exiled. The page disappeared from the records entirely, but the story remained, passed down in gossip and half-remembered verse. And here's your truly bizarre but very real fringe fact. Some male nobles had documented same-sex favourites, young men given lavish gifts, private chambers, even minor titles. The most famous examples come from kings and high-ranking lords, especially in the later medieval period. King Edward II of England, for instance, had an infamous relationship with Piers Gaveston, a knight of lower birth whom he showered with jewels, lands, and personal affection. Chroniclers couldn't decide whether to call it scandal or romance, most just called it excessive. Gaveston was eventually executed by political rivals, but not before the court was practically buzzing with rumours. So how did people navigate this in private? Very, very carefully. Many of these relationships were veiled in spiritual language. Brotherhood and sisterhood became safe zones for expressing love, touch, devotion. People learned to speak in glances, in coded poetry, in the sharing of personal items. A ribbon tucked in a tunic, a gesture repeated during Mass, a secret meeting behind the stables or in the library alcove. Castle life was cramped, but it was also full of little hideaways, hidden stairwells, watchtower landings, tapestry niches. A good secret doesn't need silence, it needs opportunity, and castles offered just enough. But when secrets slipped out, because they always did, the consequences varied wildly. Some nobles were quietly punished, sent to distant estates, or given politically convenient marriages. Others were publicly shamed, even executed. A bishop in southern France was burned at the stake for maintaining unnatural relations with several younger priests, despite his standing. Meanwhile, a noblewoman in Bavaria was quietly exiled to a convent after being caught, in her nightdress with a companion, joined in a most unchristian posture. The church preferred her gone, not dead. out of sight, out of scandal. Which brings us to a lingering academic debate. Was there ever a space, emotional, spiritual, or even physical, where same-sex love was quietly accepted in castle society? Some historians say yes. In certain courts, especially in France and Italy, relationships between women were seen as harmless, even charming, as long as they didn't disrupt marriages. Between men, the line was sharper, but not always enforced unless power or inheritance were threatened. Others argue that the danger was constant, that even whispered affection could be weaponized by rivals, that love had to hide, always. And yet, despite the risk, despite the pressure, it happened, over and over again, in letters, in poems, in the margins of prayer books, in half-finished drawings of two figures clasped together in bed, left behind in a squire's pack or tucked in the hem of a nun's habit. You reach the end of the gallery now and stop at a narrow window. The stars are out, scattered across the sky like the scattered names of all the lovers history didn't write down. You imagine them, the secret couples, the unspoken bonds, the touch of a hand in the dark when the rest of the world was asleep. There was no word for it then, not one that was kind. But it didn't matter. They made their own words, their own spaces, their own kind of love. Because even in a world ruled by fire, stone and steel, the heart still found its way to burn. The castle kitchens are still warm from the evening's frenzy, stone ovens cooling, copper pots drying near the hearth, the air thick with lingering meat grease and the faint sweetness of overripe pears. In the corner, a scullery maid wipes a tabletop, humming quietly, stealing glances toward the far hallway. She's not alone. You can feel it, the weight of 1,000 secrets pressing down through the ceiling beams. And tonight, it's time to drag one of the juiciest out of the shadows, the problem of the pregnant mistress. Because surprise, nobles, lords, barons, even kings were not exactly known for keeping it in their hose. In a world where marriage was about alliances and land more than attraction, passion often went wandering, and it usually wandered right into the arms of a chambermaid, a governess, a servant girl, or some pretty young widow who showed up at court, seeking protection. And when that passion resulted in a baby, well, things got messy. Let's start with the basic structure of noble life. Marriages were arranged. They weren't about love or compatibility. They were contracts, sealed with titles and dowries. And because many of these noble unions were, let's say, less than romantic, it wasn't uncommon for noblemen to take mistresses. It was practically expected, so long as it was done discreetly. A lord with a mistress was scandalous. A lord with a mistress who got pregnant. That was a full-blown political problem, especially when the mistress lived in the castle. Now, let's be clear, there were many levels of mistresses. Some were fleeting, a night or two with a servant during a particularly boisterous feast. Others were longer term, women who were kept inside apartments, given gowns and gifts, occasionally even lands of their own. These women often wielded considerable influence, soft power, whispered advice, pillow talk diplomacy. And some of them were clever enough to rise through the social ranks, shaping decisions from behind the bed curtain. But pregnancy, that was always the gamble. For a nobleman, a mistress's pregnancy posed 3 problems. 1. Reputation. Even in a culture where everyone knew it happened, fathering a child outside your marriage was a stain, especially if your wife was struggling to conceive. 2. Inheritance. Bastards, as they were bluntly called, could muddy bloodlines. If a nobleman died without legitimate heirs, an illegitimate son might try to claim the title. 3. Jealousy. Nothing turned a noble household into a simmering pot of venom faster than a favoured mistress swelling with child, while the lady of the house quietly embroidered fertility symbols into every pillow. So what did they do? Well, a lot depended on who the woman was. If she was lowborn, she might be dismissed quietly, sent off to a convent for her own protection, or married off to a willing or well-paid man willing to claim the child as his own. This was common. There are entire records of castle servants suddenly disappearing, only to reappear a year later, married and conveniently raising a baby born early. If the mistress was more established, say, a noblewoman in her own right, or a long-standing companion, the situation became far trickier. Some noblemen tried to pass the child off as their wife's, which required a frankly hilarious amount of stage management, falsified timelines, isolation during the late stages, midwives sworn to secrecy. One story tells of a duke who faked a pregnancy for his wife, complete with a stuffed belly and staged labour just so he could legitimise his mistress's child. The baby was smuggled in under a basket of laundry. The deception held for years. Of course, not all these efforts succeeded. Sometimes the pregnancy couldn't be hidden. The swelling belly, the gossip, the sudden illness, from bad bread that lingered for months. People noticed. And when they did, scandal bloomed like mould in a wine cellar. Nobles wrote angry letters, bishops made veiled threats, mothers-in-law got very involved. If the lord wasn't careful, he might find himself facing pressure to disown the child, or worse, to send the mistress away entirely. And the child. That depended too. Some illegitimate children were quietly raised in noble households, acknowledged but never formally included in inheritance. They might become squires, clerks, monks. Others were fostered to relatives or loyal vassals and educated with care. A few, if they were lucky, charming or male, were officially legitimised, often through royal decree. Henry II of England, for example, had numerous illegitimate children who became knights, nobles, even bishops. Power has a funny way of making room for inconvenient offspring. But for every nobleman who owned his mistake, there were 5 more who pretended nothing happened, denied paternity, left the mother to fend for herself, or worse, tried to erase the evidence entirely. Some mistresses died in childbirth, their deaths barely noted in castle records. Others were accused of witchcraft, seduction, or tempting a holy man from his duties. In many cases they were simply forgotten, except by the children they left behind. Here's a strange, lesser-known fact. Some castles had secret nurseries, often near the servants' quarters or tucked behind the kitchens. These were unofficial spaces where illegitimate babies were kept out of sight. Wet nurses were sworn to secrecy, and the children were raised in this grey zone. Not quite noble, not quite common. Some grew up and became staff. Others left at a certain age, their true parentage known only to a few. There's a recorded case of a young man in 15th century Burgundy who served as his own half-brother's stablemaster for years, without either of them knowing it. And then there's the academic question no one can quite agree on. Did these women, these mistresses, these mothers of noblemen's bastards have any real agency? Some argue yes. They used what power they had. They negotiated. They played the game. Others say no. Most were victims of their position, coerced, abandoned, and silenced. And the truth, as always, lies somewhere in the smoke-filled middle. There were clever mistresses and cursed ones, loved ones and loathed ones, survivors and casualties. Back in the kitchen, the scullery maid sets down her rag. There's a look in her eyes, calculating, unreadable. You can almost hear her thoughts. Maybe she's waiting for someone. Maybe she's late. Maybe her secret is already growing beneath her apron, and she's wondering if he'll notice, or if he already has. Maybe she knows the name of the midwife in the next village, the one who doesn't ask questions. Maybe she's counting silver coins under her mattress, saving for a wedding that will never come. Because in the great stone halls where alliances are forged and reputations are polished to a shine, a single pregnancy can ripple through everything. A mistress's swollen belly might not topple a kingdom, but it can certainly tilt the bed of power. The great hall smells of smoke and wax and something else. Sweat, maybe, or fear. There's a strange hush here tonight, not the usual after-dinner lull where nobles pick meat from their teeth, and wine spills lazily down the side of golden goblets. No, tonight the hall is heavy. The torches seem to flicker just a little more nervously, because something is off. A servant walks past with her eyes downcast. A knight speaks too softly. The lady of the house pretends to sip from her cup but hasn't swallowed a drop in 10 minutes. Why? Because a scandal has surfaced, and not just whispered in the corridors or buried in the bedsheets. No, this one has clawed its way all the way into the courts and records, and suddenly everyone's trying to pretend they're not imagining what exactly went on behind the curtain. Welcome to castle sex scandals and salacious trials, where the truth gets dragged into the daylight and nobody escapes clean. Let's start with the very medieval idea that sex, power and the law were hopelessly tangled. In theory, noble households were expected to be paragons of virtue. In practice, a noble court was like a reality show with swords, affairs, illegitimate children, jealous spouses, curious servants, ambitious lovers. It was a recipe for chaos. and when things spiralled out of control, it often landed in court. And not just the "Your Grace, I lost my cow" kind of court. We're talking trials for adultery, seduction, sexual coercion, even witchcraft by lust. Take, for example, one of the most famous castle sex scandals in Europe, the Tour de Nesle affair. Picture this, it's 1314, France. King Philip IV has 3 sons, all married to noblewomen. But rumours start swirling that the 3 daughters-in-law are spending a little too much time in a certain tower in Paris, with a couple of low-ranking knights. And by spending time, I mean full-blown affairs, complete with gifts, clandestine visits, and at least one reported incident involving a silk rope used to sneak a lover into a window. Discreet? Not exactly. Someone tells Queen Isabella, daughter of Philip IV and wife of England's Edward II, and she promptly spills the tea. King Philip investigates, the knights are tortured, classic medieval move, confess, and are promptly executed in one of the most brutal ways possible. The women, publicly humiliated, their heads shaved, imprisoned for life. That tower, the Tour de Nesle, becomes a symbol of scandal so infamous, it inspires songs, plays, and centuries of gossip. It's like medieval TMZ, but with more beheadings. But scandals didn't always happen in royal households. Every noble castle had its own dirty laundry, and sometimes that laundry got aired in court documents. In 14th century Yorkshire, a lord was brought to trial for coercing a maiden servant to the act of knowing, which, medieval euphemism aside, meant sexual assault. The woman testified in front of the entire manor court, and though her words were carefully recorded by a male clerk who clearly didn't enjoy writing them down, her voice comes through, firm, furious, and heartbreakingly precise. The lord claimed she invited his favour. The court fined him lightly. She left the castle shortly after, but not every case ended in shame. In fact, one particularly spicy case in 15th century Italy involved a noblewoman accusing her husband of refusing his marital duties. She claimed he was too busy with his falconer, yes, that kind of busy, and had not shared her bed in over a year. She demanded restitution. The court asked her to provide witnesses to their lack of intimacy. She delivered. Her maid, her confessor, even her cook testified that the lord was more enamoured with the company of men than women. The case was dropped before a judgment could be made, but not before it became the story in every noble court from Venice to Naples. And then there are the trials that veer straight into the bizarre. One particularly baffling case involves a knight who accused his wife of seducing his own falcon. Yes, you heard that right. According to the records, he claimed she lay naked with the beast and spoke to it in tones of lewd invitation. Was she actually trying to sleep with a bird? Probably not. Was he trying to cover up his own infidelity or discredit her for inheritance reasons? Almost definitely. But the fact that someone sat down and wrote this in an official court record? That's the real miracle here. Of course, these trials often reflected broader anxieties about gender, power, inheritance, and control. A woman accused of adultery could lose everything, her land, her children, even her life. A man accused of the same, he might suffer political embarrassment, but rarely more. This wasn't just about morality. It was about who was allowed to wield desire and who was punished for it. Sex was political currency in the medieval world, and when it turned toxic, it dragged entire households into the muck. One of the most haunting cases on record involves a young maid named Mariette, accused of seducing a visiting squire in the guest chambers of a southern French castle. She claimed it was mutual. He claimed she bewitched him. The lord of the castle had her interrogated, meaning tortured, and she confessed, probably to anything they asked. She was hanged. He returned to Burgundy and got a promotion. Her story only survives because a scribe unusually included a note in the margin. She died praying for her mother. The marginalia is smudged, possibly by a tear, possibly by ink spilled in haste. Either way, someone wanted her story remembered. Which brings us to the scholarly debate still alive today. Did these trials reflect actual behaviour, or were they tools of control? Some historians argue that castle sex scandals were real and widespread, an inevitable result of close living quarters, repressed passion, and feudal entitlement. Others believe the trials were more about silencing women, punishing outsiders, and keeping noble reputations intact by sacrificing the vulnerable. The answer, unsurprisingly, is both. The truth was messy, and the records are messier. Back in the Great Hall, the air hasn't cleared. People are still watching each other out of the corners of their eyes, pretending not to be curious. A goblet drops. A laugh rings out too loud. Somewhere in the silence you swear you hear someone whisper, "They've brought it before the bishop." And just like that, the story becomes legend. Again. Because in a world where reputation is everything and secrets are currency, nothing spreads faster than scandal, and no fire burns hotter than the one lit by desire exposed to daylight. The corridor is colder tonight. Even wrapped in furs, you feel it in your bones, the kind of creeping chill that settles in stone and silence alike. You're following a torch-wielding steward up a narrow spiral staircase, one that doesn't lead to a banquet hall or a lord's chamber. No, this path ends at a much smaller door, one with an iron ring for a handle and a tapestry hung nearby to make it less noticeable. The room behind it isn't grand. It's a girl's chamber. And tonight, we're entering one of the darker truths of medieval castle life, the world of child brides and power plays. Let's not sugarcoat this. What we're about to talk about is uncomfortable, but it's also essential. Because when you peel back the romantic layers of chivalry and courtly love, what you often find underneath is this: a young girl barely past her first bleeding, married off to a man twice, sometimes 3 times her age. Not for love, not for partnership, but for property, legacy, land, alliances, politics. Child marriage wasn't rare in medieval Europe. It was standard procedure for the nobility. The church officially set the age of consent for girls at 12, and for boys at 14. And while that didn't mean consummation always happened immediately, it often did, especially when political pressure or family ambition came knocking. In castle terms, a girl was considered marriageable the moment she could bear children. Whether she was emotionally, mentally, or physically ready, well, that wasn't exactly a priority. And these weren't peasant girls we're talking about. These were noble daughters, girls raised in cold stone nurseries with governesses who taught them embroidery and silence. Girls who had titles instead of toys, whose worth was measured in dowries, and whose virginity was watched over like a national treasure. Some of them were married off by the time they were 7, their husbands adults who'd visit once a year until the girl came of age. Others were taken straight to their husband's castle at 12 or 13 and expected to become women overnight. One of the most famous examples, Margaret Beaufort, mother of Henry VII, married at 12, pregnant at 13. She nearly died in childbirth. Her husband died soon after. She never had another child. Her story is held up as tragic, but at the time, it was just business. Margaret wasn't seen as a child. She was a vessel for a bloodline, a key in the political lock. And then there's Isabella of Valois, who was married to King Richard II of England when she was 6. He was 29. To be fair, the marriage wasn't consummated while she was still a child, but it was still a formal, legally binding marriage. She was paraded through the court as a queen, dressed in jewels and silks she could barely walk in. After Richard's death, she was remarried, this time at 16, which probably felt ancient to her. It's not that no one thought this was strange. Even in their own time, there were people who raised eyebrows, who muttered under their breath. But the pressure to secure alliances, to make sure land, titles and bloodlines stayed pure, was stronger than any sense of discomfort. The girl's body wasn't her own. It belonged to her father until marriage, and then to her husband. Her consent, legally irrelevant. And yes, these girls were expected to produce heirs as soon as they could, which meant sex, whether they understood it, wanted it, or not. Some noblemen waited until their wives matured. Others didn't. There are haunting, half-erased references in court records to unfortunate results of early consummation, hemorrhaging, death, miscarriages that tore the child from the womb before it could be useful. That last phrase isn't invented. It's from a 14th century household account. Useful. Imagine being seen as little more than a reproductive tool and not even living long enough to be one. You found your way into a quieter part of the castle now, somewhere past the upper chambers, beyond the formal halls where politics and performance rule. Here, the tapestries are faded, the furniture older, the corridors less travelled. It's the kind of space where servants go to hide, where old retainers take their afternoon naps, where people assume nothing important happens. But tonight, this dusty wing is exactly where we need to be. Because tonight we're peeking into the royal bedroom. Not for scandal, not for drama, but for something even more curious. the long, uncomfortable silence of celibate kings and asexual queens. It's not the first thing people imagine when they think of medieval royalty. After all, kings were supposed to be virile symbols of masculine strength, bedding maidens between battles and fathering armies of heirs. Queens were meant to be fertile vessels, glowing with maternal grace, popping out sons like saints on a feast day. But history doesn't always cooperate with fantasy. In fact, sometimes the most powerful figures in the kingdom had absolutely no interest in sex, and sometimes that wasn't just a personal quirk, it was a national crisis. Let's start with one of the biggest unspoken truths about royal marriage. Consummation was political. The bed wasn't just for sleeping, or even just for intimacy. It was the site of proof. The moment a royal marriage was consummated, it became valid in the eyes of the church and the law. Without consummation, a marriage could be annulled. Lands could be lost. Alliances could crumble. And heirs, forget it. You can't inherit from a union that was never made whole, as they like to put it. So what happened when a royal couple just didn't do it? Sometimes it was obvious. The king would make excuses. The queen would retire early. Midwives and advisors would whisper. Maids would eavesdrop. And before long, the rumours would start. Was he impotent? Was she frigid? Was there some secret aversion? Was one of them in love with someone else? Or with no one at all? One famous case involved King Richard II of England, who married twice and fathered exactly 0 children. His first wife, Anne of Bohemia, was described as beloved but distant. The two reportedly shared great affection, writing letters, reading poetry together, but very little else. After her death, Richard remarried a literal child, Isabella of Valois, and again, no heirs. There's been centuries of speculation. Was Richard gay, asexual, traumatized, religious, all of the above? No one knows. But what is clear is that the lack of a royal heir left a gaping hole, one that ultimately contributed to his downfall. When kings don't produce, others circle like vultures. Then there's Isabella of France, married to Edward II. Their union was famously dysfunctional. Edward showed little interest in Isabella, and far too much in his male favourites, Piers Gaveston and Hugh Despenser, both of whom were showered with titles, gifts, and the kind of intimate attention Isabella never received. Some scholars argue that Isabella's later rebellion against Edward wasn't just political, it was personal. A lifetime of neglect, of being sidelined and publicly humiliated, of existing beside a man who refused to play the part of husband. She eventually led an invasion against him, overthrew him, and installed their son on the throne. That's one way to fix a marriage. But not all unconsummated or sexless royal unions were the result of preference or betrayal. Sometimes they were driven by personal beliefs. There are records of rulers, both kings and queens, who were intensely devout, convinced that abstaining from sex was the highest form of spiritual discipline. Some slept in separate beds from the first night onward. Others reportedly engaged in sex only when ordered to by their confessor, and then with all the enthusiasm of a tax audit. Take Louis IX of France, later St. Louis. Though he had 11 children, clearly not entirely abstinent, he famously scolded his nobles for enjoying sex too much, even within marriage. He himself fasted regularly, wore hair shirts, and is believed to have refrained from intimacy for long stretches. His personal writings include comments about the dangers of fleshly indulgence, even with one's own spouse. His queen, Margaret of Provence, may not have agreed. Letters suggest she was more physically affectionate than Louis was comfortable with. There's a line in one account that reads, "The queen wept that her husband loved the church more than her body. Ouch." And sometimes, of course, the issue wasn't spiritual, it was physical or psychological. Impotence was a serious concern in royal circles, and not just for the men. If a queen was believed to be barren or cold, the pressure was immense. Midwives were summoned, baths were drawn, herbal remedies brewed, candles blessed by saints were lit. One physician recommended that queens eat roasted rabbit hearts to stimulate desire. Another advised walking barefoot over churchyard soil. Desperate times. There are letters too, frustrated, pleading letters, from kings begging their wives to present themselves more eagerly, and from queens accusing their husbands of spending more time with dogs than with them. These weren't just private complaints. When a royal couple didn't consummate their marriage, entire nations suffered. Treaties could be nullified, inheritances could vanish. rival claimants could rise, sexual disinterest became a threat to national security. And yet, what if, bear with me, some of these rulers were just not that into it? There's growing interest among scholars in medieval asexuality, a concept rarely explored in older histories. It's possible, even likely, that some historical figures simply didn't experience sexual desire in a typical way. But because the medieval world didn't have a vocabulary for that, because everything was viewed through the lens of sin, virtue, or reproduction, these people were either labelled saints or failures. Celibacy was holy if chosen, but damning if accidental, which raises a compelling debate. How many of these supposedly broken royal marriages were actually just misunderstood? How many kings were asexual? How many queens quietly appreciated the lack of demands? How many marriages endured, even thrived, in emotional closeness but physical distance? History doesn't record affection as loudly as it records heirs, but now and then you catch glimpses. A shared book of prayers, a letter signed with care, matching rings buried side by side. You're standing in that faded corridor again, and you pass a locked door, one that once belonged to a queen who never bore children. The records say her husband visited her chamber only once in 20 years. No scandals, no mistresses, just distance. And yet, they were buried together. She requested it. He approved it. Maybe love isn't always what it looks like in the tapestries, because in a world obsessed with breeding, with bedchambers and bloodlines, sometimes the most radical thing a couple could do was nothing at all. Down the winding steps you go, past the guest quarters, the feasting hall, the wine cellar that probably smells like spoiled ambition, and now you're entering a far less regal part of castle life. There's a door here, low and thick, reinforced with iron. You open it slowly. The air that hits you is humid and perfumed in a way that no herb garden or chapel ever smelled. You've found the hallway to indulgence, the back alley of nobility's best-kept hypocrisy. Tonight, we're talking about the brothel castle pipeline, how noblemen scurried out from their thrones and into the arms of women they publicly condemned. Let's not pretend medieval brothels were rare. They were everywhere. Towns, cities, even outside monastery walls. In fact, many brothels operated with official licenses. Some were owned by city councils, some were taxed by the crown, and some, oh yes, were discreetly funded by the very nobles who swore they wanted them shut down. There's even documentation of a brothel operating inside what used to be a bishop's palace. If that doesn't scream subtle, I don't know what does. But what makes the brothel castle connection particularly juicy isn't just the existence of brothels, it's who was using them. Noblemen, supposedly paragons of Christian virtue and knightly restraint, were among the most frequent customers. And not just the single ones. Oh no. Married lords, freshly betrothed heirs, even widowers in mourning black, all found their way down the winding streets to the red lanterns and open shutters. You can practically hear the creaking floorboards and rustle of coin purses. Here's the double standard laid bare. Castles were fortresses of control. Noble women were locked down tighter than a saint's reliquary. No unsupervised visits, no scandal, no slips. But noblemen, entirely different game. They were expected to explore their appetites before marriage, even after marriage. Their sexual conquests were winked at, sometimes bragged about. Knights returning from campaigns didn't just bring back loot, they brought stories of foreign women and exotic pleasures. And when they weren't at war, they found satisfaction closer to home. But let's be clear, not all brothels were equal. There was a hierarchy. At the top, the elite houses, sometimes called stews or bathhouses, located near major castles or inside affluent towns. These weren't grimy alley operations. They were plush, candlelit, full of soft pillows, velvet drapes, and expensive perfumes. The women here were often trained in music, dance, and conversation. Some could read. Some were former courtiers who'd fallen from favour. Others were simply born into poverty but groomed into elegance. A few even had repeat clients among the nobility who treated them like unofficial consorts. Then there were the mid-tier houses, less perfumed, less polite. Located near gates, taverns, or near soldiers' quarters, these places catered to guards, squires, and the less refined noblemen. The drinks were stronger, the music louder, the expectations a little messier. And finally, the street-level brothels or cribs, where women worked in dangerous, unregulated conditions. These places saw a darker side of medieval sexuality: violence, disease, abandonment. Many of the women were coerced or trafficked. Some were children. There are no romanticised tapestries here, only the cold stone of reality. So why would a nobleman, with his private bedchamber and an arranged pure-as-driven snow wife, risk everything for a night at a brothel? Well, several reasons. Freedom for one. Brothels didn't demand heirs or paperwork. There were no family alliances to preserve, no political ramifications if a mistress was unsatisfying. A nobleman could indulge his kinks without judgment. He could experiment. He could be soft, or cruel, or both, and he could leave. Some brothels kept client books, discreet ledgers tracking which nobles visited, what they requested, how much they paid. Some of these have survived, often under the euphemistic cover of guest registries. There's one from 14th century Bruges that includes a symbol next to certain names: a falcon for military men, a rose for romantic clients, a dagger for those who required discipline. Interpret that how you will. And yes, noblemen sometimes brought friends. Entire hunting parties would stop at brothels after long days of chasing deer. Some castles even had arrangements with local houses, special rooms reserved for noble guests, servants instructed not to ask where their lords had gone. One account describes a duke disappearing every Tuesday like clockwork, returning in time for vespers smelling of clove and cinnamon, and always in a suspiciously better mood. But here's the twist. Many of these same noblemen sat on councils that regulated the very brothels they frequented. They signed edicts enforcing curfews for loose women. They punished those who sold sex outside of licensed zones. They attended mass and took communion. Sometimes the morning after visiting a madam they'd paid extra to stay silent. It was hypocrisy on a royal scale, and everyone knew it. But as long as the scandal stayed behind a curtain, no one complained. Unless, of course, it didn't. Scandals broke when noblemen got too attached, when mistresses grew pregnant, when gifts went missing from castle treasuries and turned up as necklaces around a courtesan's neck. One lord nearly lost his title after it was discovered he'd installed his favourite brothel girl in a hunting lodge and was giving her military stipends. Another noble was blackmailed by a brothel madam who had letters, love letters no less, signed with a wax seal that matched his personal coat of arms. And then there were the cover-ups, servants paid off, madams threatened, pregnancies terminated or not. In one case, a nobleman fathered a child with a brothel worker and brought the child to live in the castle, claiming it was his late cousin's orphan. The child grew up a stable boy. Nobody dared question it. Now let's shift perspective for a moment. What about the women in these brothels? What power did they hold? It varied wildly. Some were trapped by circumstance. Others rose to considerable influence, especially those who understood politics. A few became informal advisors to the lords they serviced. There's a famous example of a madame in Lyon who negotiated peace between two feuding houses simply because she had the ears, and other parts, of both family heads. The court records don't officially credit her, of course, but everyone knew. Scholars debate whether brothels offered any form of agency for women. Some argue they were one of the few places where a woman could earn, learn, and influence, however precariously. Others point to the violence, the disease, the constant fear of abandonment. The truth lies somewhere in between. For some, brothels were prisons. For others, a grim kind of power. You leave that narrow hallway now, stepping back into the open air of the castle courtyard. The stars are out, and in the distance you hear laughter, loud, careless. A group of young knights stumble back from a late ride, cheeks flushed, clothes askew. One of them is humming a tavern tune. Another winks at the stablemaster. You know exactly where they've been. Everyone does. And tomorrow morning they'll kneel at mass, kiss rings, swear oaths, speak of honour and purity. Because in the medieval world, virtue was a costume, and desire was a journey taken in secret, through side doors into smoky rooms and back again before sunrise. The castle gardens are silvered with moonlight now, hushed and pale. You walk beneath the trellises, past beds of rosemary and drooping lavender, the air fragrant and strangely clean compared to the rest of the castle. This is where the ladies stroll in daylight, fans fluttering, gossip drifting like petals in the breeze. But at night, these manicured paths become the setting for an entirely different kind of ritual, because now we're talking about contraception, medieval style, or more accurately the desperate, creative, sometimes horrifying ways women in castles tried to prevent pregnancy. Let's start with a reminder. Birth control, in some form or another, has always existed. Just because it wasn't advertised in shop windows or prescribed by men in white coats doesn't mean women weren't figuring it out. In fact, they had to. When your job was to produce heirs but not too many, when your status depended on your body, when a single pregnancy could ruin you or kill you, you got clever, or desperate, or both. So what did they use? Well, first came the herbs. The castle gardens weren't just for show. Tucked between the thyme and daisies were plants with names that practically screamed meddling with nature. Pennyroyal, rue, Queen Anne's lace, wild carrot, tansy, mugwort. These weren't decorations, they were weapons. Midwives and healers passed down recipes for teas, tinctures and pessaries, small herbal inserts placed inside the body, to either prevent conception or, if necessary, disrupt an early pregnancy. And these remedies weren't just superstition. Modern science has confirmed that some of them contain compounds that can, in fact, affect fertility and menstruation. The knowledge was real, the risks were too, because dosage was everything. 1 pinch of pennyroyal might bring on a late period, 2 pinches might bring on liver failure. Some herbs, like savin or hellebore, were both abortifacient and toxic, and the problem with castle medicine, it was often guesswork. So women relied on tradition, whispered advice, and midwives who knew just how far to push without tipping over the edge, usually. Then there were the physical methods, some of which are creative, to say the least. One medieval text recommends a plug made of linen soaked in red wine and ground acacia bark. Another suggests a ball of wool doused in oil and inserted before intercourse. There are mentions of sea sponges, beeswax caps, and even dried crocodile dung, though that last one seems to have wandered in from ancient Egyptian texts. Whether anyone in medieval Europe actually used it is still debated, but it turns up in more than one medical manuscript, as if some medieval doctor was like, hey, it worked for Cleopatra, right? And here's a truly fringe but real recipe from a 14th century herbal guide. Mix the ash of a burned weasel with goose fat, apply below the navel, and then avoid all thoughts of conception. That last bit might have been the only effective part. But perhaps the most common form of birth control, especially in the upper echelons of castle life, was timing and abstinence, carefully orchestrated through religious calendars and female intuition. Noble women were often educated in their own cycles, or at least taught to track signs. They might avoid sex during fertile periods, use prolonged breastfeeding to delay ovulation, which also served the convenient purpose of spacing out heirs, or request spiritual retreats during sensitive times. You could say the Virgin Mary got a lot of indirect credit for preventing inconvenient pregnancies. Still, all of this came with a cost. If a woman was caught actively preventing pregnancy, especially a married noblewoman, she risked accusations of sorcery. Because if you didn't want children, clearly something unnatural was going on. The church predictably took a hard stance. Contraception was a sin. Every act of sex was meant for procreation. Anything else? Lust. And lust in the medieval playbook was a straight shot to hell, especially when practiced by women. So women had to be subtle, covert, clever. Midwives became gatekeepers of reproductive knowledge, part healers, part alchemists, part secret keepers. Some were revered, others were feared. A few were executed for interfering with the will of God, which usually meant helping someone not get pregnant, or helping them undo it after the fact. There's one chilling account of a midwife in Flanders who was burned for stealing souls before they entered the world. Translation, she'd helped too many noble girls out of tight situations. Speaking of noble girls, what about unmarried women? They had even more to fear. A pregnancy out of wedlock wasn't just inconvenient, it was ruin, and it happened a lot. The whispers tell of handmaids suddenly dismissed, noble daughters quietly sent to convents for their health, entire castle wings shut off during suspicious illnesses. In the margins of estate records there are sudden notations. One less at table, maid replaced, donation made to the Sisters of Mercy. It doesn't take a historian to connect the dots. There's even a recorded case of a baron's niece who fell pregnant and tried to pass it off as divine conception. Yes, that kind. No one bought it. She was exiled. The child was adopted into the household under another name. The only reason we know the truth is because her confessor left a letter in the cathedral archive, begging for her forgiveness. Whether he meant the confession or the act is left unclear. Let's not forget men's role in all this, or more often, their refusal to play one. Male contraception was rare but not unknown. Withdrawal was practiced, though frowned upon. There are vague references to linen sheaths, primitive condoms, but they were expensive, uncomfortable, and usually used to prevent disease rather than pregnancy. Most noblemen didn't worry about consequences. They had coin, lawyers, and church connections. If a servant girl got pregnant, that was her problem, or her shame, or her midwife's next challenge. Which brings us to the real tragedy. Contraception in the medieval castle wasn't about freedom, it was about survival. Women didn't use herbs and sponges because they wanted control over their bodies in a modern sense. They did it because they were cornered, by politics, by family, by the terrifying prospect of dying in childbirth, again and again before the age of 30. And yet, in their quiet, hidden ways, they did claim a kind of control. In gardens, in kitchens, in whispered conversations over embroidery hoops, they passed down knowledge. Not just how to avoid pregnancy, but when, with whom, and at what cost. It was a shadow education, a resistance dressed as housekeeping, a science in the language of flowers. You stop by the rosemary bush, reach out and crush a sprig between your fingers. The scent bursts into the air, sharp, clean, familiar. It was used for memory, they said, and maybe that's what this is all about. Remembering the ones who never got to tell their stories, the women who chose not to carry, who chose their futures in secret under moonlight, beside a midwife who only nodded and said, "Drink this, then rest." Because even in a world ruled by kings and priests where virtue was demanded and silence enforced, some women still found a way to choose. It's nearly dawn now. The castle is quiet in that uncanny way it only gets before the servants wake, before hooves clatter in the courtyards, before bells toll for matins. You're in the solar, the private family chamber near the top of the keep. Here, everything feels softer. The walls are hung with tapestries, faded but beautiful, scenes of knights and ladies, saints and lions, stitched by hands that likely trembled with exhaustion. A low fire crackles in the hearth. A few candles gutter near the window, and across the room, tucked into a chest, lie the quiet blueprints of a legacy, love letters, tokens, and the rarely spoken truth of what happened when sex actually led to love. Because here's the real twist in this whole medieval tale. Sometimes, beneath the marriages arranged by contracts, beyond the scandals and whispers, outside the politics and piety, people actually fell for each other. Real love, not courtly fiction, not transactional alliance, just inconvenient, irrational, burning desire that turned into devotion. It happened. It even happened in castles. Let's start with the most unexpected place of all. Arranged marriages that worked. Yes, many were cold, strategic and strained. But now and then, two people met at the altar as strangers and grew into partners. They shared a bed, raised children, managed estates, and over time built something real. Not the fireworks of a troubadour's song, maybe, but a quiet, enduring love, built from small gestures, shared burdens, and that rarest medieval luxury, trust. One such story comes from Eleanor of Aquitaine and Henry II of England. Sure, their marriage eventually exploded into mutual loathing and rebellion, but early on it burned hot. Passionate letters, political partnership, a dozen children. They travelled together, hunted together, fought side by side. There's even a poem she wrote, unsigned but widely attributed to her, describing the fire that does not burn, only binds. Sounds like someone was into it. Then there's John of Gaunt and Catherine Swynford. He married her off to someone else, had children with her while still married himself, and, after 2 decades and a royal scandal, finally married her for real. Their descendants eventually included the Tudors, which just goes to show a love affair written off as improper can still end up founding a dynasty. But not all love stories were sanctioned. Some lovers met in secret, ladies and knights, scribes and stewards, widows and younger men. Their relationships hidden in corridors and pressed into letters passed through keyholes. Some wrote in code, using the language of flowers, chess metaphors, or biblical references to disguise their meaning. A simple, "the rose blooms near the rook" might mean, "I saw you with her again, and I'm dying." Romantic, completely. Infuriating. Also, yes. You'll find their stories in the margins, literally. Medieval manuscripts are filled with marginalia, doodles, jokes, complaints, and sometimes confessions. One illuminated psalter includes a tiny drawing of two lovers kissing behind a bush, hidden from the hunting party in the main scene. Another has a prayer written in elegant Latin, until, in the last line, it breaks into the vernacular. My heart is hers, and she knows it not. These weren't public declarations, they were survival strategies. Because open affection, especially between two people not meant to be in love, could be deadly. And what about women loving women? Or men loving men? We've touched on it already, but here in the privacy of the solar, it deserves space to breathe. In a world that offered no framework for queer love beyond sin and secrecy, some people still managed to find each other. Nuns wrote each other longing letters across cloister walls. Squires held hands behind tapestries. Two women in 15th century France lived together as companions for 20 years, raised a child and were buried side by side under a shared epitaph. No trial, no scandal, just two names carved into stone, linked by a conjunction, et, and. Here's a sweet little fringe fact. In some castle households, lovers gave each other tokens, not just rings or brooches, but personal everyday things. A lock of hair wrapped in silk, a sleeve ribbon, a piece of linen embroidered with initials no one else would recognise. There's a preserved love note from a servant girl to a page, found in a thatched cottage on an estate. I keep your laugh in the hem of my sleeve. That's the kind of thing you whisper into a shared bed on a stolen night. And yes, some of these romances ended in tragedy. Betrayals, forced separations, political marriages, banishment. There's a castle in Wales where a noblewoman supposedly threw herself from the tower after her lover was executed for defying her father. No proof of the story, of course, just a cold spot on the stairs and a local superstition that says the wind sounds different on anniversaries. Is it a ghost? Maybe. Or maybe it's just the echo of choices never granted. But some lovers made it. They carved out lives together, despite everything. A minor baron and his steward who shared a bed for 40 years and were buried in matching robes. A noblewoman who arranged for her husband's illegitimate child to be raised in the castle, and who loved the boy like her own. A lady-in-waiting and her mistress who travelled together for decades, refusing separate marriages. These weren't grand epics. They were quiet resistances, love surviving not in spite of medieval constraints, but through them, and scholars still debate it all. Was medieval love real, or just romanticised nonsense layered on top of alliances? Some argue that most recorded affection is exaggerated, wrapped in courtly language and retrospective sentiment. Others point to the evidence hiding in marginalia, in forgotten letters, in wills that name lovers over blood relatives. The truth, as always, is both. Yes, the medieval world was harsh, transactional, and patriarchal, but also human. People still found ways to ache for each other, and sometimes that ache turned into something lasting. Back in the solar, you pull open a drawer in the old writing desk. Inside, a letter, folded so many times it's nearly torn at the creases. The wax seal is faded. You unfold it gently. The handwriting is careful. No names, just an opening line. You are the one thing I do not regret. You smile. Somewhere someone risked everything to write that, and someone else kept it. Because in a world built on arranged marriages, political pregnancies, and reputation over reality, love still happened. It crept in through the cracks. It lingered after the candles burned low. It stayed, hidden in the hem of sleeves, the scent of rosemary, the warmth of shared breath under a wool blanket. And maybe, just maybe, that's what kept the castle alive. So now here we are, at the edge of the story, the last stretch of shadow before the sun climbs over the castle walls. You've wandered every draughty hallway, peeked through every keyhole, crouched behind enough tapestries to have a permanent crick in your neck. You've smelled the sweat and herbs and candle wax. You've heard the moans of pleasure, of pain, of something in between. You've seen what they tried to keep quiet, the secrets, the scandals, the love that dared to breathe in cold stone halls. And here's the thing. The truth about sex in medieval castles. It wasn't tidy. It wasn't gallant. It wasn't some Disney-fied series of chaste glances and noble vows. It was messy, raw, full of contradictions. Men who preached chastity but visited brothels weekly. Women who found freedom in whispered rituals and forbidden herbs. Kings who couldn't perform. queens who simply didn't want to, lovers who left behind no children, no titles, only a badly hidden letter and a silk ribbon tucked into a chest no one was supposed to open. And yet, through all the control, the arranged marriages, the church's looming threats, the omnipresent fear of scandal, desire still survived. It always does. Sometimes in twisted forms, sometimes in resistance, sometimes in love so quiet it left no footprint except a name scribbled in the margin of a prayer book. You've seen the politics of the bedchamber, the fear of fertility, the terrifying weight of innocence weaponized. You've learned how noble women found agency where none was offered, how pleasure was carved out in dark corners, how brothels operated next door to sanctuaries, and how the same man might visit both in one day. You've seen how gender, power and survival twisted around one another like ivy choking a stone tower, and sometimes even managed to bloom. Maybe it wasn't what you expected. Maybe it was worse. Maybe it was real. So tonight, as you lie back in your own bed, in a room with no torches or tapestries or sanctified guilt, remember this. The people in those castles weren't so different from you. Not really. They fumbled through love and lust, longing and loneliness just like anyone else. They made mistakes. They found joy. They found each other, or lost each other, or pretended they didn't want what they could never have. And they left behind stories that we're still trying to decipher, not just the big bloody ones, but the quiet ones too. The stolen glances, the embroidered initials, the moment someone chose touch over duty. Or didn't. Maybe that's the real legacy of sex in medieval castles. Not the scandals or the punishments or even the politics, but the reminder that even in the coldest, most controlled spaces, the heart still moved. Sometimes awkwardly, sometimes beautifully, but always relentlessly human. So dim the lights. Let the past curl around you like the edge of a woolen blanket. Let the castle fall silent behind you. Let the ghosts of lovers and queens and midwives rest. And let yourself finally breathe. Because the night's been long, and the story, it's been waiting centuries to be told.